Chapter 656. Luo Fan's breath seemed to have used an indescribably mysterious method to compress the entire cave-desolate world, causing the void of the primordial world to naturally produce endless primordial energy. Text first. After all, the endless primordial energy was born from the entire primordial world. Although Luo Fan's main goal was to absorb it for himself and increase the speed at which Dharma power units were born, the primordial world, the amount of primordial energy that Luo Fan absorbed was naturally extremely small. However, this kind of vitality was born from the entire primordial world and spread throughout the entire primordial world. The amount of vitality that Luo Fan absorbed was naturally extremely small compared to all the vitality that was born from the entire primordial world. As a result, although Luo Fan had absorbed an endless amount of primordial energy, there was still a huge amount of primordial energy that was scattered throughout the entire primordial world. It even caused the density of the primordial world's primordial energy to increase noticeably. The reason why this breath had such unbelievable power was because Luo Fan had already attained the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit. The Zenith Heaven Tao fruit was a perfected Tao fruit. It represented that Luo Fan had completely formed his own body. His body could be said to have turned into an incomparably complete and perfect small world. This small world could not compare to the primordial world in any aspect, but in essence, it was not much different from the major kiliacosm. Moreover, although it was essentially the same as the major kiliacosm, his body did not have the characteristics of the major kiliacosm that could transform into endless spacetime and possess infinite matter. Instead, it was extremely condensed. All of its essence was condensed into a body that was less than 10 feet tall. Because of this body was many times stronger than the major kiliacosm in some aspects. For example, the impact on the primordial world belonged to that aspect. If it was an ordinary major kiliacosm, it might have a considerable impact on the spacetime of the primordial world. However, it would at most affect a region of the primordial world. However, that was not the case for Luo Fan. That was because he had completely abandoned the other characteristics of the major kiliacosm. His ability to influence the spacetime of the primordial world was countless times stronger than that of the major kiliacosm. Therefore, under Luo Fan's will, his breath naturally activated the fruit of Daluo Wei, causing the fruit to affect the spacetime of the entire untainted land through some mysterious method. It made the entire untainted land seem to be compressed by a strange force, giving birth to the endless primordial qi. Before this kind of divine power appeared, even Luo Fan would never dare to make such a guess. The reason such a change had occurred was merely because he'd activated it instinctively after attaining the golden immortal Tao fruit, and he'd naturally executed it. However, Luo Fan had already attained the golden immortal Tao fruit after all. Perhaps he wouldn't be able to notice it no matter how he guessed it beforehand, but he only had to think about it afterwards to completely understand the reason behind it. At this moment, he had completely figured out the reason why his breath was able to produce such a huge change. He couldn't help but feel an indescribable joy in his mind. Attaining the golden immortal Tao fruit actually has such a divine ability. It's a pleasant surprise. This must be a divine ability that can only be produced by cultivating the great Tao of the Tao fruit. If I cultivate other great Taos, I might obtain other divine abilities when I become a connate Zenith Heaven, but it's absolutely impossible for the primordial world to improve as well. This thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. After that thought, Luo Fan had an inexplicable guess. No wonder my cultivation of the great way of the Tao fruit in this life has been so smooth. Perhaps it's because the great way of the Tao fruit can improve together with the primordial world. That's why I can cultivate the great way of the Tao fruit to my current realm without any disasters or tribulations. Although this thought erased the suspicion of Luo Fan's hard work, it was very likely to be the truth. After all, Luo Fan was extremely clearly aware that since he'd reincarnated into the primordial world and became a Pishio, even though he seemed to have stumbled and spent countless hundreds of millions of years, seemed to have encountered numerous tribulations, exhausted boundless energy, and encountered numerous dangers to cultivate to his current cultivation realm and attain the golden immortal Tao fruit. However, that was only in terms of encounters. In terms of cultivation, as soon as he reincarnated into the primordial world, he looked up and comprehended the Tao fruit with the help of Pangu's primordial spirit. After that, he successfully obtained the earth immortal Tao fruit and became an itinerant immortal. After that, he reached the perfected immortal realm, the golden immortal realm, obtained the primordial unity Tao fruit, obtained the primordial unity true number, the primordial unity golden number, and finally obtained the zenith heaven Tao fruit. His journey could be said to be unimaginably smooth. In the words of a novel, it was as if he had the help of God. The reason for this was that when he reincarnated, the primordial world had just been created. The supreme great Tao was still faintly discernible. All the rules and laws were revealed in the world without much concealment. There was also endless chaos essence energy that was extremely suitable for cultivation in the world. But more importantly, it was because there was a mysterious force that was helping and protecting him. If not for that, Luo Fan might have been able to obtain the zenith heaven Tao fruit in the end. However, the time he needed to spend might have increased by 100 times, 1,000 times, or even 10,000 times. After thinking through that, Luo Fan did not feel frustrated. In order to obtain the zenith heaven Tao fruit, not only did one's strength have to reach that realm, one's mind and Tao heart had to reach that realm as well. If he could not reach any of these realms, he would not be able to obtain the zenith heaven Tao fruit. The zenith heaven was the meaning of perfection. When his mind and Tao heart reached that realm, it naturally meant that his mind and Tao heart had already reached the realm of perfection. Since he was already at the perfected realm, negative emotions like frustration and self-doubt would naturally not appear in his heart. Therefore, although he knew that his current achievements might not be completely the result of his hard work, Luo Fan only had a deeper understanding of the primordial world. He did not feel frustrated because of that, nor would he doubt himself because of that. However, he would not be happy because of that fact. After a while, Luo Fan let out a long breath. Then, he took a deep breath. Just like before, the entire primordial world seemed to be compressed, and endless essence energy was produced out of thin air. Among them, endless chaos essence energy around his body condensed towards him out of thin air and was directly absorbed by his zenith heaven Tao fruit, causing the speed at which the zenith heaven Tao fruit produced Dharma power units increased to the same speed as when he inhaled previously. The concentration of essence energy in the entire primordial world also increased by an imperceptible amount. After that, Luo Fan exhaled again. The entire primordial world relaxed and returned to its original state. Just like that, when Luo Fan inhaled, the primordial world seemed to be compressed. Endless essence energy was born out of thin air, and a small portion of it was absorbed by him. Most of it was distributed to every inch of the primordial world, causing the concentration of essence energy in the primordial world to increase slightly. Every time he exhaled, the primordial world would relax and return to normal, as if nothing had happened. Crap. Chapter 657. During the entire process of breathing, it was as if the entire primordial world was breathing along with him. Every time the primordial world breathed, boundless vitality would be generated out of thin air, causing the concentration of vitality in the entire primordial world to increase imperceptibly. Text first. During this process, the primordial world continued to grow, as if it was breathing along with Luo Fan. To Luo Fan, improving his cultivation level was the most important thing for him now. Compared to this, everything else was secondary. Therefore, after attaining the zenith heaven Tao fruit, He threw everything else to the back of his mind besides improving his cultivation level. No matter how turbulent the primordial world was, no matter how the situation in the primordial world changed, no matter how unpredictable the distribution of luck in the primordial world was, he only breathed leisurely in the Wuji Palace in the void. A breath that could cause the entire primordial world to expand and contract naturally could not be an unconscious breath. At the very least, it was not an unconscious breath for Luo Fan. At this moment, with every breath Luo Fan took, he had to focus his mind and activate the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit. He had to rely on some incredible and mysterious connection to touch the time and space of the primordial world, causing the entire primordial world to expand and contract along with his breath. Under such circumstances, even though Luo Fan had already attained the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit and had unfathomable wisdom, he did not have the spare time to think or comprehend other things. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of thousands of years had passed. In these hundreds of thousands of years, Luo Fan's every breath would attract endless power to gather and pour into his De Luo fruit of the great firmament, causing the Dharma power units produced by his De Luo fruit of the great firmament to increase at an unimaginable rate. During these hundreds of thousands of years, Luo Fan had breathed billions of times. The amount of vitality produced by his breathing had reached an unbelievable level, and the number of Dharma power units produced by his Zenith Heaven Tao fruit had also reached an unimaginable level. However, even so, his Dharma power units had only replaced an area of less than 100 acres in his sea of consciousness. There was still a long way to go before he could completely replace the entire boundless world of his sea of consciousness with magical power unit. Who knew how many hundreds of thousands of years he would need to achieve that? Although compared to the entire sea of consciousness, the improvement was extremely small. In fact, compared to hundreds of thousands of years ago, the power and consciousness of Luo Fan's magical powers had improved by many times. At the very least, his Zenith Heaven Tao fruit had been completely consolidated and could no longer be shaken. Moreover, apart from that, Luo Fan had completely mastered the breathing that caused the entire primordial world to contract and contract along with it. It had become his instinct. At this point, the breathing that caused the entire primordial world to expand and contract did not need to consume even a trace of Luo Fan's energy. It had already become like his normal breathing. He no longer needed to control it, nor did he need to focus. At this moment, all of his mind and energy had been completely released from the breathing, and he could already comprehend other mysteries. If the current Luo Fan faced Luo Fan, who had just broken through and attained the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit, Luo Fan would definitely be able to easily kill him at this moment. It could even be said that no matter how he attacked Chen Shi back then, he would not be able to suffer even the slightest bit of harm. This was the result of the changes in the past hundreds of thousands of years. The Tao fruit was unfathomable, but in general, it was divided into 4 realms. The earthly immortal Tao fruit, the grand unity Tao fruit, the zenith Tao fruit, and the primordial chaos Tao fruit that Luo Fan only knew of but was completely unable to understand. The difference between these 4 realms was like the difference between the heavens and the earth, and it was practically great to the point of causing one to feel despair. Moreover, when one attained the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit realm, every single bit of improvement would bring about an unimaginable increase in strength. That sort of improvement could be barely described as 10 times or even 100 times. As his mind was released from the breathing, Luo Fan finally had the chance to start comprehending the power of his divine ability after attaining the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit hundreds of thousands of years after attaining the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit. His breathing continued, but his eyes gradually closed. His mind guarded his body, and the changes inside and outside of his body gradually appeared in his mind. The situation where his control of his body became imperfect due to the rapid increase in his cultivation realm was quickly disappearing. An indescribable sense of freedom was born from his heart. In a trance, His mind improved and expanded infinitely. It was as if the endless space-time of the primordial world was wrapped by his mind, and everything in the universe entered his heart. So, this is the zenith heaven. Unknowingly, such a thought appeared in his mind. Although he had attained the zenith heaven Tao fruit for hundreds of thousands of years, it was only at this moment that Luo Fan truly understood what kind of mysterious existence the zenith heaven Tao fruit was. After comprehending the zenith heaven Tao fruit, Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes. Everything in front of him had changed drastically from the past. The boundless Wuji Palace, the boundless starry sky, and the boundless primordial world were no longer the same as before. Instead, they seemed to have been compressed into a painting and unfolded in front of him without any reservation. He seemed to have transcended the Wuji Palace, the boundless starry sky, and the primordial world. He had become someone who stood at a position that was far above the three, looking down at them from the sky. Under such circumstances, the Wuji Palace, the boundless starry sky, and the primordial world were no longer secrets to him. As long as he was willing, he could see any detail in any location in an instant. It was as if he had become an omniscient, omnipotent, and supreme existence. This feeling was so wonderful and so real that Luo Fan almost could not help but immerse himself in it. However, Luo Fan had already attained the zenith heaven Tao fruit after all. His mind and Tao heart had already reached the great perfection realm. As soon as this feeling of immersion appeared, it was instantly extinguished by him. At the same time, he instantly understood that this feeling of omniscience and omnipotence was merely an illusion. It was an illusion brought about by the improvement of his perspective, and becoming countless times stronger than before. Omniscience, and omnipotence naturally existed. However, it could only be achieved by an existence that had attained the Chaos Tao fruit. At this moment, Luo Fan had just stabilized his zenith heaven Tao fruit, and he was still millions of miles away from that realm. How could he achieve this now? As expected, when Luo Fan extinguished that feeling of immersion, he discovered many things that he had not discovered before. Chapter 658. That state seemed to be omniscient, and omnipotent. But in reality, if one were to sense it carefully, they would know that this omniscient, and omnipotent state had a huge flaw. Text first, in fact, this limitless void palace was refined by Luo Fan himself. Everything inside was naturally clear to him, no matter how big or small it was. It was extremely natural for him to be omnipotent within this range. However, in the endless starry sky outside, only a large area near the infinite void palace could be similar to the interior of the infinite void palace by Luo Fan. As for the primordial world, although he could sense the rough outline of the entire primordial world, he could only do so. For example, he could sense which region had mountains and lakes, and what the terrain was like. However, he could not understand what was on the mountains, what was in the lakes, and what the living beings on the various terrains were like. As for the living beings fighting in the primordial world, unless the commotion caused by it was too great, it would be impossible for him to know. After understanding this flaw, Luo Fan completely woke up. He opened his eyes slightly, and his gaze instantly became clear. The Daluo Tao fruit is unfathomable. Although this perception is an illusion, it is also a direction. If I work hard in this direction, I will definitely be able to achieve that in the future. Such a thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. As his thoughts spun, he had completely forgotten about the unimaginable perception ability just now. His mind was focused on the other mysterious powers after attaining the Daluo Tao fruit. To Luo Fan, attaining the Daluo Tao fruit could be said to be the greatest breakthrough he had since he stepped into the primordial world. Artifact. No ads, full text, updates before and after attaining the Daluo Tao fruit, the increase in his cultivation realm, the increase in his cultivation, and the increase in the power of his abilities were even greater than when he had not stepped onto the path of the Tao and reached the peak of the primordial unity gold number. One could imagine how great the change was. Therefore, at this moment, the various mysterious powers that Luo Fan possessed after attaining the Daluo Dao fruit were so numerous that they were almost indescribable. In a narrow sense, the current Luo Fan was not much different from the legendary omnipotent Luo Fan in terms of manifestation. Under such circumstances, it was naturally unrealistic to describe what kind of incredible abilities he would possess after attaining the Daluo Dao fruit. The earthly immortal Dao fruit is divided into the itinerant immortal, true immortal, and golden immortal realms. The grand unity Dao fruit can be divided into the itinerant number, true number, and golden number. This Daluo Dao fruit can also be divided into 3 realms. As this thought flashed through his mind, countless strange information flowed through his mind. It continuously revolved and revolved around, continuously reorganized and combined, and finally, to be transformed into an extremely small piece of information that contained the supreme great Tao. I see, the Daluo Dao fruit has already formed its own boundless world, which should be differentiated by Tao. The realm I am in now should be the Daluo Loose Tao, followed by the Daluo True Tao and the Daluo Gold Tao. Luo Fan suddenly understood. As he understood this, his body shook slightly. In a trance, it seemed that the mist that covered his eyes had suddenly dispersed. As he opened and closed his eyes, the time and space that he could completely control and sense suddenly expanded by 100 times. At the same time, the number of magic power units derived from the Daluo Dao fruit in his dantian suddenly increased explosively. In an instant, it made his sea of consciousness rain completely composed of magic power unit. The rain spread throughout the entire sea of consciousness, replacing some of the details that were scattered throughout the sea of consciousness, but it was no longer concentrated in a specific location like before. In this way, although these magic power units were extremely minuscule existences compared to the entire sea of consciousness, the influence they produced spread throughout the sea of consciousness, making the sea of consciousness faintly feel a bit more real. The result of this was that the vitality that was born everywhere in the sea of consciousness was mixed with a trace of characteristics that could be revealed from the outside world. Although it was not much, it was already a qualitative leap compared to before. The reason for such a huge change was not complicated. Although Luo Fan had already attained the Daluo Dao fruit hundreds of thousands of years ago, apart from the various mysteries that the sword lunatic displayed at the moment when the world was split apart, he had also relied on the Daluo Dao fruit that he had obtained from the Earth universe. Under this situation, he had indeed refined the Daluo Dao fruit that was suitable for the primordial world and naturally attained the Daluo Dao fruit. However, that was not from the Dao fruit great Dao, nor was it because of cultivating the Dao fruit great Dao that he attained the Daluo Dao fruit. The difference during this period did not make any difference to the result. He had both attained the Daluo Dao fruit. However, he didn't start from the Dao fruit grand Dao. Instead, he started from comprehending the mysteries of the Daluo Dao fruit and used the Dao fruit grand Dao to attain the Daluo Dao fruit. Although he attained the Daluo Dao fruit in this way, his understanding of the Daluo Dao fruit could be said to be in a state where he knew but didn't know why. This state could gradually improve as he familiarized himself with the Daluo Dao fruit, and in the end, he would completely grasp and understand the Daluo Dao fruit. However, the time required was extremely long, and it was rather difficult. On the other hand, if he started from the grand Dao of the Dao fruit and directly advanced bit by bit through his previous cultivation to attain the all-heaven Dao fruit in the end, then he would naturally be able to fully grasp and understand everything once he attained the Dao fruit. This familiar process would naturally be unnecessary. This was the difference between the two methods to attain the Daluo Dao fruit. Originally, this difference was impossible to change. However, Luo Fan was the creator of the Tao fruit after all. Even though he'd relied on the supreme divine might of Pangu's origin spirit during the process of creation, Pangu's origin spirit had been created according to his memories and thoughts, so it was no different from his own creation. Thus, it was possible for Luo Fan to make up for this difference. This possibility was to define and perfect the Daluo Tao fruit in the Tao fruit realm, just like what he'd just done. So long as he was able to define and perfect it, then the so-called unfamiliarity and knowing but not knowing why would naturally disappear, and his grasp of the Daluo Tao fruit would directly skip the entire process of familiarization. He would directly reach the state of complete control. The reason for this was very simple. The Daluo Tao fruit that Luo Fan had comprehended actually contained all the profundities contained within the Daluo Tao fruit. The reason he couldn't completely grasp the Daluo Tao fruit was merely because he was unable to effectively transform it. On the other hand, the process of defining and perfecting the Daluo Tao fruit was the process of directly completing this transformation at its foundation. In this way, the Daluo Tao fruit would naturally be under his complete control. On the other hand, once the Daluo Tao fruit was under his complete control, all its potential would naturally be brought forth, and it was extremely natural for such phenomena to occur. Chapter 659. Although the realm of Daluo Tao fruit was divided into 3 realms by Luo Fan's comprehension. However, Luo Fan was only in the realm of Daluo dispelling Tao at this moment. Therefore, he was naturally clear about what kind of magical power the realm of Daluo dispelling Tao possessed, but he had almost no understanding of the 2 small realms of Truth Tao and Metal Tao. He could only faintly sense the existence of these 2 realms. He was unable to fathom what kind of magical power these 2 realms possessed, and what kind of inconceivable mysteries they contained, nor could he understand how these 2 realms were broken through. Therefore, for Luo Fan at this moment, even if he had sorted out the 3 realms of Daluo Tao, even if he had completely controlled the Daluo Tao fruit, even if he had made great progress because of this sort of sorting and control, he could only inhale and exhale like he did for the past hundreds of thousands of years. He allowed the Daluo Tao fruit in his body to give birth to the infinite mana units that continuously surged into his sea of consciousness, changing the foundation of his sea of consciousness. As for whether his cultivation would break through the Daluo dispelling Tao realm after changing the foundation of the entire sea of consciousness in the future, even the current Luo Fan had no clue about it at all. With a thought, Luo Fan had already suppressed all kinds of thoughts. At the same time, a piece of information that had been silent in the depths of his memory from the universe of Earth, who knew how far away reappeared and occupied almost all of his attention. That was the scene of the moment when the crazy swordsman succeeded in creating the world. As mentioned before, the creation of the world was an existence that could only be barely touched after attaining the primordial Tao fruit or becoming a sage. As a result, the profundities revealed at the moment when the world was created could only be barely comprehended after attaining the fruit of chaos or becoming a saint. Apart from these 2 existences, cultivators with insufficient cultivation, even if it was Luo Fan who had already attained the Daluo Tao fruit, would absolutely not be able to completely comprehend the mystery contained in that instant. Therefore, for Luo Fan, this scene contained endless profundities. It would allow him to comprehend it for an endless amount of time, until his own cultivation achieved a corresponding breakthrough. It was even to the extent that Luo Fan had a wonderful feeling in his heart. It seemed as if he didn't need to rely on anything else from now on. He only needed to fully comprehend the scene at this moment, and he would be able to improve his cultivation realm continuously. In the end, he would be able to easily break through the Daluo Loose Tao and attain the Daluo True Tao, or even the Daluo Golden Tao, or even the even more profound and inconceivable immemorial Tao fruit. However, as soon as this wonderful feeling appeared, Luo Fan's rationality instantly extinguished it. If it was so easy to break through realms, then it would be child's play. Moreover, in the legendary primordial world, many Chaos Fiend gods born in the Khanate world had seen Pangu create the world with their own eyes. However, not many Chaos Fiend gods had become saints. Even if the legend was just a rumor, in the current primordial world, there was Hongjun who had seen Pangu create the world with his own eyes. In the end, didn't he still have to worship him as his master in order to quickly cultivate his magical powers and attain Tao fruit? From this point, it was enough to show that the scene of the creation of the world could not allow a cultivator's cultivation realm to improve limitlessly. There must be some kind of mysterious restriction within it. Only in this way could it be justified. Although he knew these facts rationally, for the current Luo fan, the scene contained in the moment when the sword lunatic created the world was still an incomparably precious existence to him. It could still allow his cultivation realm to continue to improve, and finally reach an inconceivable existence. Therefore, with a thought, Luo fan focused all his attention on the scene at that moment. This time, he was no longer in the state where he could only obtain some incomprehensible profundities, no matter how he comprehended before attaining the Daluo Dao fruit. Almost at every moment, all kinds of information that described the mysteries of a certain great Tao flowed through his mind, allowing him to understand some kind of extremely profound or extremely simple truth. His cultivation realm also slowly increased at an almost imperceptible speed during this process. And as he wholeheartedly comprehended the scene of the sword lunatic creating the world, every breath he took drew endless yuan qi into his body and into his Daluo Dao fruit, causing his Daluo Dao fruit to give birth to countless units of Dharma power at an unimaginable speed. They constantly surged into his sea of consciousness, changing the foundation of his sea of consciousness, making the sea of consciousness constantly move closer to the form that truly existed in the primordial world. The Dharma power units should have surged in both directions, both inside and outside of his body, and constantly filled his entire body. However, during those hundreds of thousands of years of breathing, his entire body had already been filled with these Dharma power units. The newly generated Dharma power units could only continuously surge into the sea of consciousness. While Luo fan was doing this, time passed by slowly. Unknowingly, more than 100 Yuanhui had passed outside the Void Wuji Palace. 100 Yuanhui was only tens of millions of years. But for the Void Wuji Palace, it was already a period of time that could only be calculated in trillions of years. This period of time that could only be calculated in trillions of years was an extremely long period of time for any living being, even for Luo fan. If Luo fan had not wholeheartedly devoted himself to the entire process of the sword lunatic creating the world during this period of time, if his Tao heart and mind had not reached the great perfection realm, perhaps this period of time alone would have been enough to make his mind collapse and spirit disappear. And since he could withstand the negative effects of this period of time, the benefits he obtained during this period of time were naturally quite considerable and quite astonishing. At this moment, in the strange palace inside the Void Wuji Palace, on the platform in the Sea of Lightning, Luo fan sat cross-legged and floated in the void. His figure was still the same as it was billions of years ago. There was no dust, no vicissitudes, no deathly stillness, not even the slightest change in movement. It was as if the billions of years of time were just a blink of an eye for him. Time did not leave a trace on his body at all. If an outsider were to see Luo fan floating in the air at this time, they would only think that he was just an ordinary person with some special abilities. It was simply impossible for them to think that the person in front of them possessed a great magical ability that could destroy the heavens and extinguish the earth. It was even more impossible to think that this person had actually floated here for trillions of years. Shit. Chapter 660. To Luo fan, the trillions of years were an extremely long period of time. During this long period of time, every breath that Luo fan took caused the entire primordial world to expand and contract. Every breath that he took would cause the primordial world to produce an extremely dense primordial energy out of thin air, causing the concentration of the primordial energy in the entire primordial world to increase continuously. Text first to the primordial world. Although this period of time was not as terrifying as it was calculated in trillions of years, it was still calculated in terms of tens of millions of years. However, it was still a period of tens of millions of years, so it could be considered an astonishingly long time. Therefore, after experiencing tens of millions of years, all the living beings in the primordial world had gotten used to the stretching and shrinking of the entire primordial world, as if it was breathing. Other than a few innate gods with firm Tao hearts and high cultivation levels, who still remembered how stable the primordial world was more than 100 years ago, almost all the living beings in the primordial world had already treated the stretching and shrinking of the primordial world as the natural appearance of the primordial world. Of course, Luo Fan was in the Wuji Palace of the Void. The flow of time was tens of thousands of times faster than the outside world. Therefore, compared to the outside world, the frequency of his breathing was so high that it had reached an unbelievable level. If not for his profound cultivation and sharp senses, it would be difficult for him to sense the existence of this stretching and shrinking. However, because this kind of stretching and shrinking lasted for more than 100 years in the primordial world, many living beings with extraordinary intelligence had comprehended all kinds of mysteries through this kind of stretching and shrinking. There were even countless mystical abilities, cultivation techniques, and spells that used the power of stretching and shrinking. In the entire space-time of the primordial world, endless primordial energy was born out of thin air. After the primordial energy was formed, other than a small portion of it being absorbed by Luo Fan to increase the speed of the Dharma power units in his body, most of the primordial energy was integrated into the entire primordial world. Under such circumstances, the free and limitless power was produced between the stretching and shrinking of the entire primordial world. Although this kind of power only caused the entire primordial world to expand and contract slightly, it was already an unbelievably powerful power for any individual. If there were living beings who could activate this kind of power through various spells and cultivation methods, it would naturally be a little exaggerated to say that it could destroy the world, but to change the world, move the mountains, and drain the seas, it would be nothing more than a piece of cake. Under such circumstances, living beings who regarded the expansion and contraction of the entire primordial world as a natural characteristic of the primordial world would naturally not let go of this power that could be easily borrowed. Naturally, there would be all sorts of mystical abilities, spells, and cultivation techniques that used this power. This change was something that Luo Fan had never expected. As for the consequences of this change, that was something to be discussed later. At that moment, Luo Fan was floating inside the strange palace. There was nothing strange about him, and he looked like an ordinary creature floating there. His body, on the other hand, had undergone earth-shattering changes after experiencing all sorts of things that had accumulated over trillions of years. The Daluo Dao fruit in his body was still producing endless magic power units and constantly replenishing the world in his sea of consciousness. His sea of consciousness had experienced countless trillions of years of evolution, and it was already very different from before. The foundation of the entire world had mostly transformed into magic power units. In other words, most of the entire sea of consciousness had been replaced by Luo Fan's magic power, and it had gone from being half illusory and half real to being completely real. The endless primordial energy born in the original world could only work in his body, and it was evolving towards a state that was no different from the primordial energy born in the primordial world. On this day, countless trillions of years later, Luo Fan's body suddenly trembled. At that moment, the space-time of the entire primordial world suddenly froze. The expansion and contraction that had been going on for tens of millions of years suddenly came to a stop. At that moment, countless cultivators who cultivated the cultivation method that used the expansion and contraction of power lost control of their power because of this change, and they were seriously injured. At that moment, countless chaotic chi that had already condensed into solid forms appeared out of thin air around Luo Fan's body and poured into his body at an unimaginable speed and method. It directly rushed into his Daluo Dao fruit, causing his Daluo Dao fruit to produce endless magic power units in an instant. The speed at which these magic power units were produced was almost trillions of times faster than the speed at which he had produced magic power units in the past trillions of years. These magic power units poured into the sea of consciousness at an extremely fast speed, causing the evolution of the sea of consciousness to accelerate rapidly. The void of the sea of consciousness that had not been replaced by the magic power units was rapidly replaced by the magic power units at a speed visible to the naked eye. The entire sea of consciousness was evolving towards the real world at a speed that was trillions of times faster than before. This change continued for 9 years. The number of magic power units that poured into the sea of consciousness was even comparable to all the magic power units that had poured into the sea of consciousness in the past trillions of years. And with such a huge number of magic power units replenished, on this day, 9 years after Luo Fan was completely wrapped in the solid primal chaos energy that was being produced, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. This change finally stopped. At that moment, the solid chaotic chi that enveloped Luo Fan suddenly collapsed. It was completely absorbed by him in an instant, and the void no longer produced any yuan chi out of thin air to replenish the consumption of the chaotic chi. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan turned back into an extremely ordinary person and floated in the void. And in his body, the sea of consciousness had reached the great perfection realm after 9 years of change. All the details of the sea of consciousness had been replaced by his magic power units. Whether it was the sky or the earth, whether it was plants or animals, even space and time, they were all constructed by these magic power units through various incredible methods. In other words, this sea of consciousness had directly turned from the original half-real and half-illusory world into a completely real world. From then on, this sea of consciousness was already a real existence to all living beings. Everything that was born in it, whether it was the primordial chi or the treasures of heaven and earth, whether it was the rocks or the plants, and even all the living beings that were born naturally in it, were completely real existences to all living beings in any universe and any world. Moreover, if Luo Fan was willing, the living beings in his sea of consciousness could even leave the sea of consciousness and appear in the untainted world. From then on, they could be like all the living beings in the untainted world. They could cultivate on their own and continuously improve themselves. It was even possible for them to finally attain the primordial chaos Tao fruit or cultivate to become a sage. Of course, if this situation occurred, these living beings would be vaguely controlled by Luo Fan. From a certain point of view, they could even be said to be an incarnation of Luo Fan. After all, the foundation of their survival and the essence of their lives were the living beings in Luo Fan's sea of consciousness. Their construction foundation was even Luo Fan's magic power units, so it was naturally impossible for them to be completely independent. When the entire sea of consciousness evolved to perfection, Luo Fan's zenith heaven Tao fruit trembled slightly, and instantly stopped the process of absorbing the primordial chi from the outside world. His breathing also recovered. However, this time, when he recovered his breathing, he completely lost the strange phenomenon that caused the entire untainted world to shrink and contract and cause endless primordial chi to condense over countless billions of years. This was naturally not because he had lost this ability. It was because it was no longer necessary. At this moment, his entire body was filled with magic power unit. It could be said that he was completely independent and did not need to rely on anything else. Naturally, there was no need for him to continue absorbing the primordial chi from the outside world. At this moment, An indescribable power suddenly descended from the dark and directly pressed down on Luo Fan. This power was extremely mysterious. It contained endless pressure and unbelievable majesty. This pressure was enough to press any mountain that was millions of meters tall into 100 times thinner than a piece of paper. This majesty was enough to make the most arrogant person in the world prostrate under this majesty and not dare to move. Under this power, Luo Fan only felt that the void around him had become completely constructed by the firmest solid in the world. It made him feel as if he needed to use all his strength with every breath he took. The majesty contained in that power made him feel as if the entire untainted world and the infinite space-time had transformed into a physical existence and were looking down on him. It even made him feel as if he could be completely crushed into pieces by this majesty at any time, and he would die and his Tao would disappear. At this moment, Luo Fan understood where this power came from and why it was born. This power came from the supreme great Tao of the unseen world. The reason why this power was produced was because Luo Fan had broken the cycle of ascension and sublimation with the untainted world. It could be said that it was the backlash of the entire untainted world. The world was not a living being, so it naturally did not have the self-consciousness of a living being. Even though the untainted world was an incredible world that far surpassed the major kiliacosm, it could not transcend this intrinsic restriction. Naturally, it could not have self-consciousness. However, although the world did not have self-consciousness like a living being, the higher the level of the world, the more it had an instinct similar to a living being. This instinct made the world naturally reject the factors that were harmful to it and welcome the factors that were beneficial to it. The manifestation of this rejection and welcome was an existence that was deeper than luck. For ordinary minor kiliacosms, medium kiliacosms, and major kiliacosms, this instinct was not very strong. Therefore, the effect of helping the factors that were beneficial to the world was rather small, and the effect of rejecting the factors that were harmful to the world was not great either. However, when this world was replaced by the primordial world, this situation changed drastically. The primordial world was a world that was countless times more advanced than the major kiliacosm. This could be easily seen from the fact that the primordial world could casually create a major kiliacosm. For such a high-level world, this kind of wonderful instinct had already been strengthened to an unimaginable level. It was strengthened to the point that it could even be like a supreme cultivator who could see through the past and the future. It could even nip the factors that might cause damage to him in the bud after a few years, and provide considerable help to the factors that might be beneficial to him in the future. It was precisely because of this that after Luo Fan comprehended the great Tao of the Tao fruit, he received a lot of help from the primordial world and successfully obtained the zenith heaven Tao fruit. However, instinct was only instinct after all. It was impossible for him to think like a normal living being, and it was impossible for him to see the situation clearly like a normal living being. In the span of more than 100 yuan hui in the primordial world, Luo Fan's every breath caused the primordial world to stretch and shrink, causing the primordial world to produce endless vitality out of thin air and increase the concentration of vitality in the world. Although this growth speed was not fast compared to the vast space of the primordial world. However, after accumulating for more than 100 yuan hui, the concentration of vitality in the primordial world was already more than 10% denser than before. In just 100 yuan hui, the concentration of vitality in the primordial world had increased by 10%. In that case, it would only take 1,000 yuan hui to double. In just 10,000 yuan hui, it would be enough to increase by 10 times. Although there would definitely be a limit in the end, the limit was obviously not 10%. Therefore, under such circumstances, Luo Fan stopped the process of mutual promotion and increased the concentration of vitality in the primordial world. It was as if he had directly cut off the incomparably bright future of the primordial world. This was completely understandable for creatures with self-awareness, complete intelligence, and the ability to think freely. Although they were unwilling, after all, their vitality had increased by 10% because of him. They could only feel sympathy for Luo Fan, but they would never dare to have any resentment towards him. However, to the primordial world, which only had similar instincts, this was an absolutely unforgivable act. It was even more unforgivable than the harmful factors that had caused the primordial world in the beginning. It was because of this that such a power appeared from the unseen world at this moment. Luo Fan's mind raced. In the blink of an eye, he had already figured out the logic behind it. He knew that as long as he breathed again and caused the primordial world to expand and shrink, allowing the primordial world to produce more vitality out of thin air and continue to increase the concentration of vitality in the primordial world, the power would disappear. But if he was unwilling to do so, then this force would instantly erupt and attack him relentlessly. Understanding this, Luo Fan could not help but smile inexplicably. Presently, I've already attained the golden immortal Tao fruit, and I've formed a body of my own. I'm self-sufficient, and I don't seek external help. It's even to the extent that the Tao I've comprehended has already taken a perfect embryonic form. It's precisely the beginning of great freedom. In this kind of situation, if I yield, even if I yield to the supreme great Tao, it will make my soul no longer complete. I won't be at ease, I won't be free. I won't do it. This thought slowly flowed through his mind and will. As this thought flashed through his mind, it was as if he had sensed some inexplicable existence. The power that had appeared out of thin air and was pressing down on him instantly trembled, and an earth-shattering change occurred in an instant. The indescribably powerful dignity disappeared, and the peerlessly powerful pressure changed. It turned into an invisible power of deprivation and slashed towards Luo Fan. The power of deprivation was like mercury flowing into the ground, unstoppable and unstoppable. It directly passed through all the defenses around Luo Fan, broke through Luo Fan's body, and rushed into his body, into his sea of consciousness, and into the depths of his spirit. The moment the power of deprivation rushed in, Luo Fan felt all kinds of mysterious existences leaving his body. They were wisps of power. At the same time, bits and pieces of memories, bits and pieces of enlightenment, separated from his memories and dispersed without a trace. In a trance, the originally clear and clear world seemed to be gradually covered in a layer of fog in Luo Fan's eyes. It seemed to be gradually becoming blurry. Even the great Tao of the Tao fruit that he had cultivated for trillions of years seemed to gradually become difficult to understand and profound and unfathomable. So that's how it is. Is it going to completely deprive me of all the insights and principles that I obtained with the help of the world in the past? Such a thought suddenly flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The situation in front of him was not difficult to understand. Any living being only needed to think for a while to completely understand what was going on. The help that the primordial world had given to Luo Fan had been throughout his cultivation process. Almost every stage of his cultivation had been more or less helped by the primordial world. The itinerant immortal realm, the perfected immortal realm, the golden immortal realm, the Tai loose number, the Tai true number, the Tai golden number, and even the zenith heaven Tao fruit that he had obtained now had the help of the primordial world. That was why he could obtain it so easily. Therefore, the power of the primordial world to deprive Luo Fan could be said to have spread to every stage of his cultivation and affected every breakthrough he made. This could be said to be shaking the foundation of his cultivation. If this continued, it might even cause his realm to regress and cause his zenith heaven Tao fruit to collapse. However, even so, Luo Fan still did not seem to care about this change at all. There was no panic or fear on his face, and his expression did not change at all compared to before. He did not make any effort to resist the power of deprivation. It was as if the power of deprivation did not exist at all. This power of deprivation naturally didn't care about Luo Fan's expression or state of mind. In accordance with the original procedure, it constantly acted on Luo Fan's body, constantly stripping away his memories and comprehension. Under these circumstances, the Daluo Dao fruit in Luo Fan's dantian gradually underwent an inexplicable change. Although it did not directly collapse, it began to give off an empty aura, as if its foundation was gradually shaking. Shit. Chapter 661. The Zenith Heaven Dao fruit was shaken, and the speed at which the Dharma power units derived from the Zenith Heaven Dao fruit fell sharply. In the blink of an eye, it was almost undetectable. Only 1 or 2 Dharma power units flowed out of the Zenith Heaven Dao fruit after a long time. Initial text 48065. Moreover, due to the shaking of the foundation, the derived Dharma power units were vastly different from before. Although there seemed to be no change in their overall appearance, they had lost most of their mysteries. They looked like strands of energy that had been forcefully pinched together. How could they still have any incredible power? Despite the changes, Luo Fan's expression remained unchanged. Even the look in his eyes was the same as before, without the slightest change. It was as if these changes that reached the foundation and affected the essence of his life were insignificant to him. The power of deprivation born from the Supreme Great Tao was unstoppable and undefendable. It affected every inch of Luo Fan's body from the inside out. The power of deprivation did not stop even after it shook Luo Fan's Tao fruit foundation. Instead, it became more and more intense. Gradually, the power of deprivation acted on a mysterious spot in Luo Fan's body, producing an effect that exceeded Luo Fan's expectations. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly felt an indescribable pain cover his entire mind, filling his entire soul. Under the pain, Luo Fan's body collapsed in an instant and turned into a strange beast. This strange beast was an existence that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with. It was the Pishio that he had attached himself to when he had transmigrated to the primordial world. After the Pishio appeared, it did not pause at all. As if it had not gone through any process, it suddenly collapsed and turned into a cloud of smoke. After this cloud of smoke appeared, it constantly twisted and spun, and it spread out at an unimaginable speed. In the end, under the effect of some incredible rule, it disappeared without a trace. After the smoke disappeared, only a ball of light as clear as water was left where Luo Fan had been. It emitted a light that could illuminate the universe, the world, the past, and the future. This ball of light twisted and contracted in the void, like a living creature breathing in and out. In this ball of light, there seemed to be a mysterious power at work. With the effect of this power, wisps of light dissipated from the light, and finally turned into nothingness. As the light dissipated, the ball of light dimmed at a speed visible to the naked eye. The sense of illumination that could illuminate the universe, the world, the past, and the future seemed to gradually weaken. I didn't expect that even my body would be taken away. Fortunately, I didn't rely entirely on the blessing of heaven and earth to reach my current cultivation realm, so it's not fatal. Such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this time, Luo Fan was in a mysterious state. After Luo Fan came to the untainted world, he attached himself to the Pishio. Although he later cultivated the innate Taoist body and transcended the limits of the Pishio's body, his foundation was already the Pishio, and the Pishio was already his body. Therefore, when the body of the Pishio was taken away, it was equivalent to directly taking away the foundation of the existence of his body, and thus taking away the innate Taoism aptitude that he had refined on this body, as well as everything he had gained from this innate Taoism aptitude. This sort of encounter was naturally lethal to ordinary cultivators, and it was even to the extent that just this sort of deprivation was sufficient to cause the cultivator to perish and disperse. But for Luo Fan, this was nothing. Although at this moment, He was suffering the attack of the supreme great Tao of the untainted world. He had not lost his essence after attaining the zenith heaven Tao fruit. The essence of self-sufficiency, and not seeking external help was still in him. Even if the foundation of his zenith heaven Tao fruit had been shaken, even if the power of deprivation was constantly taking all kinds of existences that built the zenith heaven Tao fruit from his zenith heaven Tao fruit, it could not change this fact. Under such circumstances, although losing his body was a great harm to him, that self-contained essence was enough to support his strength, support his magic power, support his spirit, support his sea of consciousness world, and support everything that his body originally supported. In other words, that self-contained essence had naturally replaced his body. This essence was only a kind of quality, a kind of characteristic. It was not even a virtual body, let alone a physical body. However, after Luo Fan attained the zenith heaven Tao fruit, this kind of quality was already powerful enough to interfere with the untainted world. It was enough to support endless Dharma power, the zenith heaven Tao fruit, and the things that Luo Fan possessed. The mysteriousness of it was simply indescribable in words. Other book friends were reading. This chapter is provided for you. After that thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, there was still no trace of panic in his mind. Instead, he even fell into absolute calmness. He allowed the power of deprivation to continuously cut away all kinds of mysterious existences in his body and allowed the power of deprivation to smoothly shake his foundation. However, no matter how powerful the power of deprivation was, no matter how mysterious and important the existence that was cut away, no matter how shaken Luo Fan's zenith heaven Tao fruit, it still remained intact and did not collapse. It was still in its self-contained essence. At the same time, it maintained the existence of Luo Fan, so no matter what Luo Fan lost, his life would not be in danger, nor would it really cause him to fall. Time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, 10,000 years passed. These 10,000 years were naturally the 10,000 years inside the Void Wuji Palace, which was also the 10,000 years in Luo Fan's perception. During these 10,000 years, the power of deprivation from the supreme great way of the untainted land was constantly acting on Luo Fan, constantly cutting away all kinds of mysteries from Luo Fan's body. The mysteries of the great way that he had comprehended under the supreme great way of the untainted land, the true meaning of thunderbolt that he had comprehended through direct observation of the supreme great way, and the true meaning of massacre that he had obtained by chance were all directly cut away by the power of deprivation. Every existence that was cut off made Luo Fan feel an indescribable pain. This kind of pain was not necessarily pain, but more of a kind of depression, annoyance, disappointment, and other kinds of negative emotions of losing something that was very important. Under the attack of these negative emotions, if it were not for the fact that Luo Fan's fruit of the Daluo Way still existed and that his mind and heart of Way were maintained at the great perfection due to the existence of these negative emotions, his mind might have already collapsed under these negative emotions and become restless. He might have even directly succumbed to the power of deprivation and compromised with the Supreme Great Way. But naturally, this situation did not happen. Therefore, Luo Fan remained indifferent towards these changes. He was not affected by them at all. His mind was still calm, and he did not panic or feel any fear. It was as if none of these changes had happened. Just how much had the power of deprivation shaved away from Luo Fan's body during these 10,000 years? No words could describe it, and no number could describe it. On this day after 10,000 years, the ball of light that was originally where Luo Fan was had shrunk to an almost undetectable dot, like a spark. It was worlds apart from the ball of light that was as bright as the moon back then. It was simply unimaginable that they were the same kind of existence. The feeling that the light originally contained, which could illuminate the universe and spread through the past and future, was so weak that even those who had also attained fruit of the Daluo Way would not be able to sense it. This was unimaginably different from the situation back then when all living beings, even those without intelligence or complete consciousness, could sense it with a single glance. Even though it was just a dot of light, the power of deprivation continued to move through it, constantly cutting away bits and pieces of light. However, the speed at which it was cutting away was countless times slower than it was 10,000 years ago. One was like a flying rocket while the other was like a moving snail. After the power of deprivation passed through the dot of light countless times, it could no longer cut away any of the light. In the end, it slowly left the dot of light and began to gradually condense 300 meters above the light. The power of deprivation constantly changed as it condensed. The characteristic of deprivation that even those with Daliu Wei could not resist gradually changed, transforming into an indescribable burst, and finally turning into an incomparably pure and condensed destructive power. It was as if these worlds could collapse under the pressure of this destructive power at any time. When all the power of deprivation had completely changed its nature and condensed to the limit in the void, when it was about to chop down on Luo Fan at any time, there was suddenly a strange wave that descended from the void. This wave was extremely mysterious and profound, to an unimaginable level. It was also extremely obscure. This wave directly swept through the unimaginable destructive power that had condensed. As the wave swept through, the destructive power seemed to have lost some key and began to gradually collapse and dissipate. As it collapsed and dissipated, the entire Wuji Palace shook, and the distorted time and space gradually calmed down and returned to normal. The powerful pressure caused by the destructive power also gradually disappeared during this process. In just a few breaths, all the changes directly calmed down. The entire Wuji Palace directly returned to the scene before this power appeared, as if everything that had happened before had never happened. At the moment the wave swept past, a trace of understanding suddenly flashed in Luo Fan's mind. This is the condensation of my contribution to the untainted world in the past. After this flash of understanding, he could not help but sigh to himself. This situation was not beyond his expectations, but it did not surprise him either. The destructive force formed by the power of deprivation was the power of the Supreme Grand Tao that wanted to completely erase his existence. In his current state, if there was no ripple to destroy the destructive force, it might not be able to kill him, but it would definitely be able to bring him down to a lower level of cultivation and destroy the zenith heaven Tao fruit that he had painstakingly sought to attain enlightenment in his current state. Although it was unlikely for him to die, it would definitely be able to destroy the zenith heaven Tao fruit that he had painstakingly sought. Although this was a huge blow to the usual Luo Fan, it would not threaten his life. But for the current Luo Fan, it was enough to be fatal. This was because Luo Fan's existence was basically maintained by the self-contained essence that came with the zenith heaven Tao fruit. If he lost the zenith heaven Tao fruit, then his existence would lose its support, and he would naturally die and his soul would scatter. Thus, it could be said that the wave had directly destroyed the destructive power and saved his life. However, don't forget how shocking Luo Fan's contributions to the primordial world were. Not to mention the incredible change in the primordial energy density of the primordial world that had increased by 10% in the past 100 yuan hui. Just the great tribulation of the world that he had eliminated 100 yuan hui ago had made the primordial world complete from its original incomplete state. Before this, he had used various methods to return the Pangu primordial spirit to the Supreme Great Tao, making the Supreme Great Tao several times more complete than before. These achievements were so great that if they were in the legends, it would even be enough for him to become a saint. However, this kind of merit only caused this wave to appear. After the endless power of deprivation cut it off, it barely allowed him to maintain the zenith heaven Tao fruit. Even though Luo Fan's mind and Tao heart were still at the perfected realm, he still found it difficult to accept the difference between legends and reality. After sighing, Luo Fan's emotions returned to normal. Since he had already expected it, there was naturally no need to waste too much energy on it. After calming down again, Luo Fan's mind moved slightly, and the scene of the moment when the sword madman created the world instantly appeared in his mind. Following the appearance of the scene that was originally incomprehensible and could no longer be comprehended or comprehended began to erupt with endless mysteries, crazily pouring into his mind and mind. This was the reason why Luo Fan had always been so calm, and without the slightest trace of panic. It had been said many times before that the creation of the world was something that could only be fully understood after attaining the primordial Hun Dao fruit or becoming a saint. Without attaining the primordial Hun Dao fruit, one could not become a saint. No matter how much time it took, it would be impossible to fully understand the mysteries. In other words, no matter how much time Luo Fan spent to understand the scene at the moment when the sword madman created the world, he would definitely not be able to fully understand it. And Luo Fan's previous experience also proved this. After attaining the Great Luo Dao fruit and achieving the Great Luo Scattered Dao, Luo Fan constantly experienced the scene of the sword lunatic splitting the heavens and earth in a time that could only be calculated in trillions of years. In the beginning, he naturally made progress all the time, and his cultivation realm improved at an unimaginable speed. But later, he found that although he could understand some mysteries from the scene at every moment, no matter how hard he tried, there were more and more mysteries that he could not understand no matter how hard he tried. This situation became more and more serious as time went on. 10,000 years ago, which was relative to the primordial world, more than 100 yuanhui after he attained the Zenith Heaven Dao fruit, this situation reached its peak. At that time, although he would be able to comprehend many mysteries from the scene in that instant, no matter how hard he tried, he would not be able to understand even a trace of these mysteries. In fact, it would be impossible for him to even remember these mysteries. No matter how much he gained from that scene in that instant, even though he knew that it was an incomparably rare and profound mystery that could bring him shocking benefits after comprehending it, in the next instant, he would directly forget about these mysteries, completely unable to find a trace of them. And it was also at that moment that his cultivation directly reached the peak of the Zenith Heaven Dispelling Dao. At that moment, Luo Fan was only one step away, one last opportunity, one last key point of understanding, and he could directly break through the limit of the Zenith Heaven Dispelling Dao and achieve the Zenith Heaven True Dao, to achieve the second realm of the Zenith Heaven Dao fruit. However, that step was directly in front of him like a natural moat, so no matter how hard he tried, he could not break through it. And it was also because his cultivation had reached that peak that the speed of the Zenith Heaven Dao fruit's production of mana units in his body instantly increased by billions of times. It only took him 10 years to completely change the foundation of his sea of consciousness, directly turning the sea of consciousness from the original half-real and half-illusory world into a completely real world. The reason for this change was very simple. It was because the peak of the Zenith Heaven Dispelling Dao required the sea of consciousness to become completely real. In other words, previously he climbed the mountain step by step, but when he reached the peak of the Zenith Heaven Dispelling Dao, it was as if his upper body had already reached the top of the mountain, and he used a rope to directly pull his lower body to the top of the mountain. The difficulty was naturally countless times lower than climbing the mountain step by step. That was why the speed was so fast. Originally, this kind of limit could not be broken at all. No matter how hard he tried, as long as he did not break through that layer of barrier and did not achieve the Zenith Heaven True Dao, he would not be able to comprehend any of the mysteries from the scene of the sword lunatic creating the world. This was the limit of the cultivation realm. Without the corresponding cultivation realm, it was impossible to obtain the corresponding comprehension ability. It was impossible to obtain the corresponding harvest. However, the current situation changed that situation. At this moment, although Luo Fan was still in the Zenith Heaven Dispelling Dao realm, He was no longer at the peak of the zenith heaven dispelling Tao. He could only barely reach the zenith heaven dispelling Tao realm, and could barely maintain the zenith heaven dispelling Tao fruit that seemed like it could collapse with a gust of wind. The various comprehensions and mysteries that he had gained from the moment the sword lunatic created the world in countless billions of years had already almost all disappeared because of the extremely close combination with the various comprehensions that he had obtained from the primordial world in the past. Under such circumstances, that kind of restriction could no longer work on him. Chapter 662. Luo Fan quietly comprehended the scene at the moment when the sword lunatic created the world. At every moment, there were countless mysterious and unfathomable mysteries that slowly flowed through his mind and mind. They were brought into the depths of his memory and transformed into his Tao. First text with this understanding, the light that represented his existence gradually separated from the originally extremely dim state that was about to be extinguished at any time. The light began to gradually brighten. After a few days, all of a sudden, the transformation stopped. This won't do. There's no way to effectively replenish and strengthen the foundation. Luo Fan stopped comprehending the scene, and such a thought flashed in his mind. With this thought, countless spiritual lights flashed in his mind. Following that, endless characters, talismans, diagrams, runes, and veined patterns erupted with a loud bang, covering the entire sky and covering the earth, and enveloping his entire mind. After the many living beings in the untainted world sensed the characteristic of the entire untainted world expanding and contracting like breathing, it only took them about 100 years to comprehend countless mysterious divine powers and Dharma arts. Luo Fan could almost be said to be the number one person in the untainted world, so how could he be inferior to them? Even if the scene at the moment when the sword lunatic created the world was countless times more mysterious than the stretching and contracting of the untainted world, the time that Luo Fan comprehended this scene was also countless times longer than the time that all living beings in the untainted world took to comprehend the primordial world. Therefore, for Luo Fan, after countless billions of years of comprehension, his familiarity with the scene at the moment when the sword lunatic created the world had already reached an unimaginable level. Under such circumstances, he only needed to think of a way to naturally create a method that could help him comprehend the scene in that instant. At this moment, the countless words, talismans, patterns, runes, and lines that appeared in his mind were the process of him creating this method. After an unknown amount of time, it seemed like only an instant, yet it also seemed like millions of years. The countless characters, talismans, diagrams, runes, and veined patterns combined in his mind to form an extremely complicated, mysterious, and unimaginably profound cultivation method. This cultivation technique consisted of billions of characters, tens of thousands of exquisite diagrams, hundreds of thousands of talismans, and tens of millions of runes. The number of patterns was almost indescribable. Its complexity had reached an indescribable level. And such a complicated cultivation method, its function was not to accelerate the comprehension of the scene in that instant. For Luo Fan, whose comprehension was limited by his cultivation level, it was meaningless. This cultivation technique only had one effect, and that was to control. What kind of mysterious control did he comprehend from the scene of lunatic sword splitting the heavens and earth? As long as he cultivated this cultivation method, as the realm of the cultivation method improved, he would naturally be able to comprehend the mysteries that matched the realm of the cultivation method from that instant, and the mysteries that exceeded that realm would no longer appear, and even the mysteries that were lower than that realm would not appear. This sort of method seemed to be completely useless, and it was instead an obstacle to comprehending that scene. But in reality, the significance of the appearance of this technique was so great that it wasn't inferior to the grand Tao fruit that Luo Fan had created. The reason for this was not complicated. Although the Great Way of Tao had a framework, and although there was a specific cultivation method, If one wanted to progress, to improve, to break through the realm, everything still needed to be comprehended by the cultivator. It needed the cultivator to comprehend the heaven and earth, to comprehend the supreme great way, to comprehend the Tao that was compatible with him, to improve his cultivation level, and finally to achieve all kinds of Tao fruits, and finally obtain eternity and transcendence. However, this cultivation technique was different. This cultivation technique alone might not be of much use, but as long as the scene of sword lunatics splitting the heavens and earth was combined with it, this cultivation technique would be able to lead him straight to the legendary primordial chaos Tao fruit and the legendary sage realm. When cultivators first started cultivating this cultivation method, they could only obtain the simplest, most ordinary, and most basic mysteries related to the foundation of cultivation. From then on, they would lay the most solid foundation of cultivation, and then in turn, they would promote the realm of this cultivation method, and then obtain a deeper level of mysteries from that scene. In this way, the cycle would repeat until they finally reached an unimaginable peak. Perhaps it was impossible to directly comprehend the mysteries of primordial Tao fruit from that scene and directly attain primordial Tao fruit. But the obstacles during this period were probably only a few bottlenecks to break through. On the other hand, this sort of bottleneck existed for any cultivation technique, and even if it was Luo Fan's grand Tao fruit, it didn't require hard work to cultivate any longer, and it required some sort of indescribable fortune. Therefore, this couldn't be considered as the limitation of this cultivation method. When this cultivation method took form in Luo Fan's mind, Luo Fan's heart couldn't help but be filled with a faint sense of joy. Fortuitous encounters were extremely mysterious, and they couldn't be considered with logic or described with words. The cultivation methods that pointed directly to the great Tao, the cultivation methods that led directly to immortality and transcendence, did not necessarily require a lot of time and effort to obtain, nor did it require a lot of effort to create. What they needed was perhaps the occasional flash of inspiration, the occasional movement of the mind. This cultivation method that Luo Fan had created at this moment was like this. Its profundity was even comparable to Luo Fan's great way of Tao fruit, but its origin was only a flash of inspiration from Luo Fan. Even the process of Luo Fan creating the great way of Tao fruit wasn't much more difficult than this process. He'd only created it by looking at Buzhou Mountain from afar and comprehending it. Even though it had the help of Pengu's primordial spirit, it was based on his will after all, and it existed because of his will. This cultivation method might be so profound, but it was difficult to replicate. In the entire primordial world, besides Luo Fan himself, probably only Hong Jun, who'd once watched Pengu split the world apart, could cultivate it. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan couldn't be bothered to name this cultivation method, and he directly called it the nameless cultivation method. After the nameless cultivation method completely stabilized, Luo Fan didn't hesitate to start cultivating according to the method described in the nameless cultivation method. This nameless cultivation method was aimed at the comprehension of the scene when the crazy swordsman split the world apart, but it had nothing to do with the body. Naturally, it could be cultivated without the body. When the nameless cultivation method was activated, Luo Fan's mind trembled slightly, and gradually, a huge change occurred. The mind was a real existence, but it was an existence that absolutely couldn't be detected by others. It was an existence that was absolutely idealistic. In other words, a person's state of mind existed for him. Everything that happened within it would have a huge impact on him, but to others it didn't exist. No matter what happened within it, it wouldn't affect others. This kind of existence could be said to be at two absolute extremes. To others, it was more ethereal than nothingness, but to oneself, it was more real than the real world. Therefore, it could be said that although the mind seemed to have no effect on living beings, it was far more important than the spirit and the body. Therefore, any change in the mind was a huge risk, and at the same time, it also contained indescribable opportunities. just like the nameless cultivation method that Luo Fan was currently cultivating. As the nameless cultivation method was activated, Luo Fan's mind began to gradually condense. The scene of lunatic swordsman's creation of heaven and earth that existed in his mind grew increasingly real. The mind's will around the scene began to gradually condense and eventually turned into mysterious particles that overlapped with each other, wrapping around the increasingly realistic scene of heaven and earth creation. Any living being, even someone as powerful as Luo Fan, could at most see the thoughts of other living beings and their memories. They absolutely couldn't see the mind of other living beings. In fact, no matter what method he used to study, dissect, or delve into the bodies and spirits of other living beings, he absolutely couldn't find the existence of the mind. At this moment, although the mind around the scene of the creation of the world had condensed into the particles, it didn't change the nature of the mind. It was still in a state that was extremely real to Luo Fan, but extremely illusory to the outside world. The nameless cultivation method continued to circulate, and the particles formed by the mind gradually began to change. Through this extremely complicated trajectory, they gradually condensed into extremely complicated patterns. Among these patterns, there were talismans, runes, lines, and all kinds of strange things that existed between heaven and earth and did not exist between heaven and earth. These patterns formed a mysterious and strange connection through the particles condensed by the mind. They interacted with each other, complemented each other, pulled each other, and promoted each other. In the end, they formed a whole that couldn't be separated by any power, and they directly covered the scene of the crazy swordsman splitting the world apart. In other words, the scene of the crazy swordsman splitting the world apart was completely integrated into it. Suddenly, Luo Fan's mind changed, and his mind suddenly disappeared. The mind was an absolute existence of idealism, and it would naturally change with the changes of one's mind. As long as one lost consciousness, it would naturally completely turn into nothingness, and as long as one's consciousness recovered, it would naturally return. At this moment, Luo Fan completely quieted his consciousness and let himself fall into a state similar to sleep, or even similar to death. In this state, he had no thoughts or consciousness, and he was equivalent to a flesh sculpture. Under such circumstances, his mind naturally disappeared without a trace. However, when the mind disappeared, the countless particles formed by the mind and the scene of the creation of the world that was wrapped and integrated into the nameless cultivation method still existed. They were in a mysterious and extremely idealistic place in Luo Fan's body. It was as if it had existed there since ancient times, as if no power could destroy it, and as if even the decay of heaven and earth could not shake it at all. This was not a lie. In fact, for everything that existed in the mind and thoughts were their world, their universe, and their everything. The fact that it could still exist after the mind and thoughts disappeared was no different from not being shaken even after the decay of heaven and earth. After a moment, Luo Fan's mind and thoughts reappeared. When the mental will appeared again, the mental will particles and the scene of lunatic sword splitting the heavens and the earth were wrapped up by the mental will particles. It seemed as though there was no difference from before. Seeing this change, Luo Fan instantly understood that his nameless cultivation method had finally been cultivated. After understanding this, an inexplicable joy surged in his mind. This joy reverberated in his mind for a long time before disappearing. Even these echoes of joy could not affect the whole of the particles and the scene of the creation of the world. They were still extremely stable and unshakable. After the joy disappeared, Luo Fan did not waste time and began to use the nameless cultivation method to comprehend the scene of the creation of the world. As he began to comprehend the mental particles that enveloped the scene, they began to circulate according to some mysterious trajectory. Every diagram, every rune, and every line began to move along with them, and in the process, they shone with all sorts of mysterious and unfathomable lights. With these changes, wisps of mystery began to float out from the inseparable whole and were directly captured by Luo Fan's thoughts. They turned into all kinds of unpredictable information and all kinds of indescribable comprehensions that integrated into his memory. During this process, Luo Fan did not feel that his cultivation level had increased, but he felt that he had understood many very basic, very simple, and very rough principles that he should have understood. The Tao fruit of the great firmament that seemed to be on the verge of collapse seemed to have stabilized because of this. Even the highest magnification microscope could not detect a trace of it. It really is effective. In this way, I can strengthen my foundation step by step and build a stable foundation again. This joyful thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. Then Luo Fan entered a meditative state and wholeheartedly received the various mysteries that he had obtained from the scene of the creation of the world through the nameless cultivation method. Time, for the current Luo Fan, was the most worthless thing. In the blink of an eye, 10,000 years had passed. In these 10,000 years, Luo Fan had obtained endless mysterious principles at every moment and comprehended all kinds of inconceivable mysteries. These principles and mysteries were not very profound, but they covered all aspects. They included almost all the principles and mysteries that ordinary mortals who had never entered the Tao before attaining the Tao fruit of the earthly immortal. Some of these principles and mysteries were obtained and comprehended by Luo Fan before he was deprived by the power of the primordial world, but most of them were things that he had never known before. It was all-encompassing and almost covered all the principles and mysteries of that level. It could be said that with these principles and profundities, if Luo Fan wanted to change his cultivation to another Grand Tao and not cultivate the Tao fruit Grand Tao, then he only needed a single thought to directly cultivate it to the peak of the adversity realm, and he didn't have to comprehend even a trace of principles and profundities. No matter which great way of cultivation he wanted to change to, it was the same. On this day, 10,000 years after he entered the state of meditation, Luo Fan suddenly left the state of meditation. With a thought in his mind, he noticed that no profundities floated out from the mental particles and the scene of creation of the world, whereas the light of the various patterns, talisman markings, striations, and talismans formed by the mental particles had strengthened to an unimaginable state. It was like a sun that had appeared in his mind, and it even caused Luo Fan to feel waves of piercing pain when he swept his mind past them. It was even to the extent that he felt as if he was gradually melting under this light. In an instant, Luo Fan understood that the profundities he obtained from the scene of creation of the world had already reached the limit of the nameless technique. If he didn't break through the nameless technique, then he would not be able to obtain even a trace of the profundities from the scene of creation of the world. When he understood this, Luo Fan knew that he'd already sufficiently solidified his foundation before attaining the earthly immortal fruit of the Tao, and it could even be said to be extremely stable. Therefore, he didn't hesitate, and with a slight thought, the nameless technique started to circulate once more. As the nameless technique circulated once more, countless mental particles started to condense ceaselessly outside the mental particles and the scene of creation of the world. The method of condensing these particles was extremely profound. It was based on the method of condensing the previous layer of particles, then it was deepened and expanded, causing the degree of complexity and profundity to increase by a few hundred times, or even a few thousand times. After an unknown amount of time, it seemed like an instant, but it seemed like millions of years. The countless particles finally stopped condensing, and the surroundings of the scene of creation of the world had already been replaced by a whole that was even larger, more complicated, and more profound than the mental particles from before. The new mental particles that appeared were still formed by countless complicated patterns, talisman markings, striations, and talisman markings, and it still had the feeling that even the decay of the world wouldn't be able to shake it in the slightest. On the other hand, the light that erupted from the mental particles seemed to have been completely concealed during this process, and it seemed as if it had been completely absorbed. One could only see that the outermost particle emitted a faint and strange light, and it didn't have the aura of the sun it had before. Along with this change, the strands of profundity that had floated out from the scene of creation of the world within the mental particles that had stopped for a long time started to appear once more. Obviously, Luo Fan's cultivation of the nameless technique had already broken through the first realm during that unknown period of time, and he'd attained the second realm, the realm that represented the earthly immortal fruit of the Tao. Or perhaps it could be said that it represented the first realm of the earthly immortal fruit of the Tao, the independent immortal realm. Chapter 663. The nameless technique was created by Luo Fan in order to strengthen his foundation and make up for the various mysterious insights that had been deprived by the great Tao of the primordial world. First published, so the cultivation realms of this nameless technique were naturally differentiated according to the Tao fruit Grand Tao that Luo Fan had created. In other words, this nameless technique was divided into 5 realms, and they respectively corresponded to the 5 realms before the earthly immortal Tao fruit, the earthly immortal Tao fruit, the grand Tao fruit, the golden immortal Tao fruit, and the chaotic Tao fruit. On the other hand, amongst these 5 great realms, the earthly immortal Tao fruit could only be considered to be an extremely small stage to Luo Fan at this moment, so there was naturally no need to differentiate it in detail. Besides this realm, the other 4 realms were just like the earthly immortal Tao fruit, grand unity Tao fruit, golden immortal Tao fruit, and chaotic Tao fruit, and they had to be further differentiated before they could be completely compared. In other words, the last 4 realms of the nameless technique had to be further divided into at least 3 small realms in order to completely correspond to the grand Tao fruit. Since the realm of the nameless technique corresponded to the realm of the Tao fruit Grand Tao, then there was naturally a corresponding barrier between each realm of the nameless technique. If one wanted to break through each realm, then one would need the corresponding comprehension of each realm. Therefore, if an ordinary person were to cultivate this nameless technique, even with the help of the scene of lunatic swordsman's creation of the world, they would fall into a bottleneck that was nearly impossible to break when they reached the peak of the first realm of this technique and could no longer obtain any more mysteries from the scene of lunatic swordsman's creation of the world. This bottleneck was the bottleneck of seeking the earthly immortal Tao fruit within the Tao fruit Great Tao. In other words, if one was unable to attain the earthly immortal Tao fruit by cultivating the Tao fruit, then no matter how much time one spent cultivating the nameless technique or how formidable one's strength was, it would be absolutely impossible for one to break through the first realm of the nameless technique. He would no longer be able to obtain any other harvest from the scene of lunatic swordsman's creation of the world. However, this restriction was naturally nothing to Luo Fan. Although Luo Fan's comprehension and knowledge of the Great Tao had been stripped away by the Supreme Great Tao, his Zenith Heaven Tao fruit still existed. On the other hand, the All-Heaven Tao fruit was a profound Tao fruit that could only be attained with earthly immortal Tao fruits and grand unity Tao fruits as the foundation. As long as the Daluo Tao fruit existed, then the earthly immortal Tao fruit and grand unity Tao fruit would naturally exist. Because the immortal Tao fruits and grand unity Tao fruits were still no secret to him. With just a thought, he would be able to attain the earthly immortal Tao fruit, or even the grand unity Tao fruit, on top of the newly laid foundation. Under such circumstances, the cultivation restriction of the nameless technique was naturally not a restriction to him, and he only needed a slight command in his mind to naturally break through the barrier and cultivate the second level of the nameless technique. When the second level of the nameless technique was cultivated successfully, the shackles that restricted him from obtaining even more profundities from the scene of creation naturally vanished, and Luo Fan entered into a meditative state once again as he continued to comprehend the newly obtained profundities that were compatible with the bodiless immortal realm. Through 10,000 years of comprehension, all the foundations before attaining the earthly immortal Tao fruit had been consolidated once more. Even though the light formed from the characteristic of the all-heaven Tao fruit hadn't expanded much compared to before, it had a trace of stability, and it seemed as if it had gone from having nowhere to rely on to finding a fixed point of support. In a trance, it had already been 10,000 years since he stepped into the second level of the nameless technique. On this day, Luo Fan broke free from his meditative state once more, and the comprehension of these 10,000 years had allowed him to completely comprehend all the profundities that were compatible with the bodiless immortal realm. There were no longer any profundities that floated out from the whole composed of mental particles, and the whole particle emitted an infinitely dazzling light as if it was a scorching sun. On the other hand, the light that represented his existence became brighter, and the sense of stability became stronger. Luo Fan had already expected this change. With a slight thought, he naturally broke through the barrier of the second level of the nameless technique and directly stepped into the third level of the nameless technique, a realm that corresponded to the true immortal realm. In his mind and will, the boundless will of his mind condensed into particles once again, and continued to build an even larger whole outside of the mental will particle, wrapping up the whole thing that was previously whole. The construction of the whole seemed simple, but in fact it contained infinite profundities. The particles of each layer had a certain degree of compatibility with the scene at the moment when the sword lunatic created the world, and they could resonate with the profundities in certain aspects. Therefore, the profundities of a certain level could be steadily drawn out. What was required was to be extremely familiar with the scene at the moment when the sword lunatic created the world, and to have an absolute understanding of each realm of the Tao fruit cultivation. Moreover, one's mind and willpower needed to reach the corresponding tolerance and strength of each realm. Therefore, even though each realm of the nameless technique seemed to be as simple as constructing the entire particle, it was actually all-encompassing. Without reaching that realm, one wouldn't even be able to know the structure of the particle in that realm. Without reaching that realm, one wouldn't be able to stabilize the particle in that realm either. It was even impossible to condense the corresponding number of mental particles. When the third layer of mental particles was condensed, the light of the mental particles naturally converged, leaving only a little bit of light to illuminate the patterns condensed on the surface of the mental particles. At the same time, as the whole particle was formed, more profundities floated out from the scene at the moment when the sword lunatic created the world. The first realm of the nameless technique corresponded to the realm before the earth immortal Tao fruit. Luo Fan pushed it to the limit, completely comprehending the profound mysteries corresponding to this realm in the scene of the creation of heaven and earth. It took him 10,000 years. The second realm of the nameless technique corresponded to the Tao fruit realm of the bodiless immortal realm. Luo Fan spent 100,000 years to push it to the limit and completely comprehended all the profundities of the scene that corresponded to the bodiless immortal realm. The third realm of the nameless technique corresponded to the Tao fruit realm of the bodiless immortal realm. This realm was countless times more profound than the second realm, and the profundities it contained were countless times more than the second realm. Therefore, Luo Fan only felt that the third realm had been pushed to the limit after 1,000,000 years, and only then did he completely comprehend all the profundities of the scene that corresponded to the bodiless immortal realm. Only then did he reach the barrier of the third realm. When he completely comprehended these profundities and pushed the nameless technique to the limit of the third realm, the speck of light that represented his existence grew slightly, and the feeling of stability became much stronger than it was 1,000,000 years ago. Luo Fan broke free from the meditative state and instantly understood the time he spent in the meditative state. He knew that he'd spent an entire 1,000,000 years to completely comprehend all the profundities of the bodiless immortal realm, but he wasn't dissatisfied at all. Instead, he seemed to be rather pleasantly surprised. With the help of the nameless technique, the effects are really remarkable. Even though I spent more time than when I sought proof out of thin air, my gains are countless times greater than before. if I sought proof out of thin air or didn't have the help of the nameless technique, then even if I had this scene of the world being split open, I would still have to spend 1,000,000,000 years to obtain the same gains. Besides such a thought in his heart, there was only joy in his heart. His joy didn't last for long before he immersed himself into his cultivation once more. The fourth realm of the nameless technique was a realm that corresponded to the golden immortal realm. If he wanted to achieve the fourth realm of the nameless technique, he naturally needed to break through the barrier between the bodiless immortal realm and the golden immortal realm. To Luo Fan, this was only a matter of a thought. Therefore, the achievement of the fourth realm was a matter of course. After Luo Fan achieved the fourth realm, he fell into a meditative state again, and was directly drowned by the profundities that floated out of the scene of the world being split open. Just like that, after a long time, the nameless technique's realm broke through layer by layer. Among them, it took Luo Fan millions of years to push the fourth realm that corresponded to the golden immortal realm to its peak. After that, it took Luo Fan hundreds of millions of years to reach the peak of the fifth realm that corresponded to the Tai scatter. The sixth realm that corresponded to the Tai true number was 1,000,000,000 years. The seventh realm that corresponded to the Tai gold number was 10,000,000,000 years. Every time the nameless technique's realm improved, it represented that Luo Fan had fully comprehended all the profundities of the corresponding realm of the Tao fruit contained in the scene of the world being split open. It also represented that Luo Fan's cultivation foundation that had been shaved off by the supreme great Tao's power of deprivation correspondingly consolidated, correspondingly filled up. More than 10,000,000,000 years later, when Luo Fan pushed the seventh realm of the nameless technique to its peak, and when there was no longer any profundities floating out of the scene of the sword lunatic's creation of the world, the spot of light that represented Luo Fan's existence had already expanded to a sphere with a diameter of 10 feet. The brilliance that it emitted, which illuminated the universe and permeated the aura of the past and future, was even 100 times stronger than when his body had just been shaved off by the power of deprivation. Obviously, at this moment, Luo Fan's foundation before attaining the golden immortal Tao fruit had already stabilized to an unimaginable peak, and it was even to the extent that it was thousands or even tens of thousands of times more stable than it was before his comprehension and memories were cut off by the supreme grand Tao. On this day, when there was no longer any profundities floating out of the scene of the world being split open, Luo Fan slowly broke away from the state of meditation. As he broke away from the state of meditation, the light that illuminated the universe and permeated the past and future skyrocketed again, and even almost condensed into a substance, turning invisible into tangible. It formed a strange space-time around him, displaying incredible scenes. These scenes were extremely mysterious. Among them, there was the primordial world, the infinite grotto heavens, the infinite small worlds, the infinite medium worlds, the infinite large worlds, the infinite past, and the infinite distant future. However, these scenes changed unpredictably. Even though they had appeared before, they couldn't be seen clearly no matter what. No matter how fast a living being's reaction was, no matter how incredible a living being's vision was, it was impossible for them to see the specific situation of these scenes clearly. So the perfection that I thought I was perfect in the past still has so many flaws. Luo Fan sighed slowly. With a slight thought in his mind, a figure with an ordinary figure and a handsome face, but a pair of eyes that revealed boundless wisdom and boundless profundities stepped out of the void step by step. It gradually overlapped with the light, and in the end they fused into one. This figure was dressed in a greenish-brown robe, with shoulder-length hair that flowed naturally behind his head. Every strand of hair seemed to fuse with some indescribable existence, and every single strand of hair seemed to be evolving some inconceivable truth of the world, as if they were expounding the profound mysteries of the great Tao. The appearance of this figure was shockingly Luo Fan's appearance. After this figure and the light merged into one, the infinite brilliance of the light naturally faded away. The endless scenes formed by the light seemed to have never appeared, and disappeared into nothingness. The supreme great Tao is attached to the body, and once it is cut off, it becomes invisible. Today I have regained my body, and now I know that I am me. After the light faded, the figure smiled and began to chant. These 4 sentences were simple and inexplicably ancient. Like the sound of the great Tao, it spread through every small kiliacosm and medium kiliacosm in the Wuji Palace. It even penetrated through the Wuji Palace and spread through the endless starry sky, into the primordial world, and swept through every inch of the void of the entire primordial world. After a long chant, Luo Fan's body shook. The strange brilliance that had shone through the universe and shone through the past and future because it had fused with his body before directly surged out of his body. It soared at an unimaginable speed, and in the blink of an eye, it had reached the state where it had condensed into a substance. If one were to speak incorporeal, then the formless would become tangible. It formed countless space-time and endless scenes around him. In fact, after reaching this level, it still didn't stop growing. Instead, it continued to grow and grow. This kind of growth caused the realness of those spaces and scenes to grow. From the original rapid change to the point where no living being could see clearly, it gradually stabilized. In the end, almost all living beings with a bit of eyesight could see the specific situation in those scenes clearly. Only then did it stop growing. At this moment, an indescribable aura at the great perfection realm abruptly emanated from Luo Fan's body. It similarly filled all the worlds within the Wuji Palace, filled the endless starry sky, and filled the entire untainted land. This aura of perfection was extremely profound and profound. Any living being who sensed this aura of perfection would be able to sense a supreme sense of perfection. It would allow them to truly understand what perfection was, and it would allow them to discover how shallow and how wrong they had been in their understanding of perfection in the past. This aura of perfection filled the world for a few minutes before slowly disappearing. When this aura of perfection disappeared, an indescribable expression of satisfaction appeared on Luo Fan's face. This is the real Daluo Dao fruit. He let out a long sigh and said in an indescribable tone of satisfaction. Everything that had happened just now was none other than the various phenomena caused by Luo Fan using the opportunity to condense a pure-born Taoism aptitude from nothingness to break through the barrier of primordial unity gold number and reclaim the Daluo Dao fruit. At the same time, it was also the various phenomena caused by the nameless technique breaking through the 7th realm and entering the 8th realm. At this time, Luo Fan floated in the air, his body constantly emitting a faint brilliance. This brilliance emitted an aura that shone through the universe and spread throughout the past and future, but it only maintained a radius of 30 feet around his body. It could not spread beyond 30 feet around his body. On the other hand, the aura of perfection on his body still hadn't weakened in the slightest, but it only appeared within an area of 30 feet around his body, and it didn't affect anything beyond that area in the slightest. Besides representing that his control of the Daluo Dao fruit had attained a state where he could control it at will, it also represented that his Daluo Dao fruit was countless times stronger than before. Because this brilliance was brought about by the essence of the Daluo Dao fruit. It could be said to be the external manifestation of the perfection of the Daluo Dao fruit. When he'd attained the Daluo Dao fruit for the first time, this brilliance that illuminated the entire universe and spread throughout the past and future could only appear when his body was stripped away and the Daluo Dao fruit was exposed to the outside world. Now, it could directly appear in the outside world through his body, and it could even be perfectly controlled to limit it to an area of 30 feet around his body. The gap between the two was obvious, and it was naturally obvious how great the gap between the Daluo Dao fruit he was proficient in was. The facts were exactly so. At this moment, within Luo Fan's body, his Daluo Dao fruit had undergone a tremendous change. Even though he was still unable to discern its form, nor was he able to determine exactly how many units of energy formed the Daluo Dao fruit. The entire Daluo Dao fruit felt like it was over 100 times larger than before. Moreover, the amount of energy units that surged out from it was over 100 times more than when he absorbed the boundless chaotic origin energy with his breathing. Apart from that, the magic power units were also vastly different from before. Every single magic power unit had become more mysterious, more complex, and more complete. This sort of change wasn't something that only the energy units that surged out from the Daluo Dao fruit possessed. Instead, it was all the energy units in his entire body and within his sea of consciousness that had undergone the same change. It was as if the energy units had been changed on a fundamental level. Along with this change, the degree of reality in Luo Fan's sea of consciousness had greatly increased. Originally, it could still be seen that it was built with magic power units as the foundation, but now, not a trace of the existence of magic power units could be seen. The entire sea of consciousness was like a real world that had been established from within the chaos, and it was utterly different from the primordial world. Chapter 664. There was an indescribable sense of perfection, freedom in his heart. This kind of perfection, freedom was many times stronger than the last time he obtained the Zenith Heaven Dao fruit. Compared to the last time he obtained the Zenith Heaven Dao fruit, the various feelings he had felt when he obtained the Zenith Heaven Dao fruit seemed illusory. Text first, he opened his eyes slightly. The void Wuji Palace, the endless starry sky, and the primordial world suddenly flattened. It was as if they had turned into 3 layers on a huge painting. They were displayed in front of him in a mysterious way. However, this painting was simply too big. It was so big that it exceeded the limits of his eyesight. It was so big that he could not see the entire painting no matter what. Therefore, in a large area near him, he could see everything clearly, no matter how big or small it was. He could see everything clearly and clearly. Even the slightest space-time tremor on the scroll could be seen clearly by the ants, and they could grasp it clearly. However, beyond these areas, he could only see a rough outline. It was as blurry as a short-sighted person looking into the distance. Even so, the area that he could completely grasp was more than 100 times larger than the last time he obtained the Zenith Heaven Dao fruit. In fact, his grasp of the area that he could grasp was even deeper than the last time. It seemed to be more free and perfect. After carefully observing for a while, Luo Fan's mind moved, and his vision returned to normal. Recasting the foundation is indeed beneficial. This time, it's a blessing in disguise. Luo Fan let out a long sigh of satisfaction. At this moment, his body was crystal clear, as if he had removed a thick layer of shackles and invisible shackles. He felt unimaginably relaxed. At first glance, his connate Dao body seemed to be no different from his previous body. However, as long as he carefully observed it, he would realize that this connate Dao body was countless times purer than his previous body. Although his previous body was also an extremely mysterious and complete connate Taoism body, it was essentially no different from the current one. However, the foundation of that body was the body of the Paixio that Luo Fan had possessed when he came to the primordial world. There were still traces of the Paixio's body in the deep imprint of the source of life. If not for that, how could the power of deprivation emitted by the Supreme Great Tao cut off the body of the Paixio from his body? However, this born Taoism aptitude was completely different from that. The power of deprivation cut off the body of the Paixio from his body and directly cut off all the imprints that were related to the Paixio. As for this body, it was constructed out of thin air by Luo Fan according to his own will, according to the brand of his soul, and according to his most original life brand. Of course, it only had Luo Fan's purest and most true brand. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan's connate Dao body could only be considered pure Luo Fan, and the real Luo Fan of Dao. He was no longer bound by any congenital shackles, and he was no longer restricted by the past. Sensing the changes in his body, Luo Fan stood straight in the air. All kinds of strange sounds suddenly came from inside his body. It was as if there were countless thunder roars in his body, and the radiation spread out. It was as if a giant beast that could hold up the sky had woken up from its sleep. At this moment, Luo Fan's every breath and every move was like the supreme great Tao appearing in the world. Almost every tremble of his body, every change of his body, every change of his movements, and every contraction of his muscles contained endless mysteries and countless profound truths. It could be said that if a living being could calm down and comprehend Luo Fan's every move at this moment, they would definitely be able to understand all kinds of profound truths and see the direction of cultivation. They could even create a cultivation method that could support them until they reached transcendence. After standing up straight, he raised his eyes and looked around him. In an instant, a feeling of awkwardness rose from his heart. The Wuji Palace that he had originally thought to be extremely mysterious and perfect had countless flaws. It seemed so crude and simple that he even felt that it would affect his emotions when he looked at it again. This feeling of awkwardness only appeared for a moment, and he immediately suppressed it. With his perfected heart and mind, he naturally knew that the reason for this situation was not because of any other reason. It was because his cultivation realm was many times higher than when he had first refined the Wuji Palace. His vision and mind were also many times stronger than before. It was not really because the Wuji Palace was crude and simple. It's a pity that with my current ability, I can't directly make the Wuji Palace form a world of its own. It still has to rely on the primordial world to exist. Luo Fan sighed in his heart. The other flaws and imperfections of the Wuji Palace were not a problem for him at the moment. He only needed to refine it once to eliminate all the imperfections and make the Wuji Palace even more perfect. However, there was another problem that he could not do anything about at the moment. That was, the connection between the Wuji Palace and the primordial world was too close. It was so close that it could not be separated. It was completely under the absolute control of the primordial world's supreme great Tao. This state was not a weakness for Luo Fan in the past. After all, his relationship with the primordial world was so close in the past. What was the point of the Wuji Palace being closer to it? However, to the current him, this was a huge weakness. The reason was very simple. After Luo Fan suffered the power of deprivation produced by the supreme great Tao of the primordial world, his essential connection with the primordial world could be said to have been completely cut off. At that time, although he still existed in the primordial world, he had already formed his own body. He was self-sufficient and did not need to seek external help. He no longer needed a single drop of vitality from the primordial world, and he was no longer affected by all the tribulations of the primordial world. In other words, the current Luo Fan was a transparent existence to the primordial world, or even non-existent. The primordial world would not give him any more benefits, nor would it create any tribulations against him. Under such circumstances, the Wuji Palace was so closely connected to the primordial world. It was rather awkward. The Wuji Palace was a primordial unity treasure that Luo Fan had refined. Luo Fan's life imprint had already penetrated deep into its origin. It was even not wrong to say that it was a part of Luo Fan's body. Therefore, the Wuji Palace was so closely connected to the primordial world. From a certain point of view, Luo Fan and the primordial world had once again established a close connection through the Wuji Palace. This was naturally a huge weakness for Luo Fan, who had just broken away from this close connection with great difficulty. Countless ideas flashed through his mind. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan knew what to do. With a thought, he shouted softly, "Where is the boy?" Along with this shout, the entire Wuji Palace shook slightly, and then a figure materialized and appeared in front of Luo Fan. The figure looked like a young man, and there was no trace of a boy at all. It was the treasure spirit of the Wuji Palace, the Wuji child. After the Wuji child appeared, he bowed and said, "I'm here. I'll follow your instructions, master." "Open the core of the magic treasure," said Luo Fan calmly. The Wuji child didn't hesitate. His body shook and transformed into a strange sphere made of countless complicated and profound three-dimensional talismans. Although the sphere was made up of countless three-dimensional talismans, it was perfectly round. Each of the three-dimensional talismans had an extremely close and mysterious connection with the other three-dimensional talismans. It seemed that if any of the three-dimensional talismans were missing, the entire sphere would no longer be perfect. It would even be unable to maintain its shape and would collapse. This sphere was none other than the core of the Everlasting Void Palace. It was also the Everlasting Void Palace technique that Luo Fan had used when he first refined the Everlasting Void Palace. Of course, the structure of the sphere wasn't exactly the same as the Wuji Palace from before. In reality, although the foundation of this sphere was still the palace technique of the Everlasting Void Palace, it was millions of times more complicated, exquisite, and profound than the technique from before. The Wuji Palace from before could only create an incomplete small world. It wasn't even comparable to a complete minor kiliacosm. If the Wuji Palace was used now, it would definitely be able to create a medium-sized world and 3,000 minor kiliacosms. It would be able to create an exquisite and profound whole, and it would be able to display unimaginable power. The reason for such a change was naturally because Luo Fan had refined and improved the Infinite Void Palace over the past hundreds of millions of years. This was because the Infinite Void Palace was the core of the Infinite Void Palace. Therefore, every refinement, improvement, and re-refinement of the Infinite Void Palace was equivalent to a change in the Infinite Void Palace. It was equivalent to an improvement in the Infinite Void Palace and a reconstruction of the Infinite Void Palace. Looking at the scale of the Wuji Palace, one could imagine how exquisite this technique had become after so many years of refinement. Luo Ho looked at the sphere in front of him. He wasn't surprised by its exquisite complexity. He pointed at the 3D rune sphere with his right hand. Following this, the entire 3D rune sphere trembled. Along with this tremble, the endless spacetime of the Wuji Palace, as well as the thousands of minor kiliacosms and minor kiliacosms. After this tremble, the 3D rune sphere began to beat like a heart. It seemed to be brewing and preparing for something. At this moment, endless magic power units gushed out from Luo Fan's right hand. They constantly flowed into the 3D rune sphere, constantly changing every rune on the sphere. Even the originally mysterious 3D rune sphere gradually adjusted and changed. At this moment, Luo Fan slowly closed his eyes. In his mind, the scene of the creation of the heavens and the earth wrapped by the mental particles shook slightly, and then strands of profound mysteries surged out and directly drowned his mind. Luo Fan didn't care about the progress of the changes in the 3D rune sphere. He directly entered cultivation. Although Luo Fan had regained the Daluo Dao fruit and achieved the Daluo Loose Dao, he hadn't pushed this realm to the limit. He hadn't fully comprehended all the mysteries contained in the scene of the creation of the world that corresponded to the Daluo Loose Dao. This could be seen from the fact that the nameless technique that Luo Fan was cultivating had only just broken through the 7th level to the 8th level. If he had already completely comprehended all the profundities that corresponded to the Grand Luo scattered Dao realm, there would absolutely be no profundities floating out of the mental particles at this moment. The nameless technique he cultivated would naturally be pushed to the limits of the 8th level and touch the bottleneck between the 8th and 9th level. Since he hadn't touched the bottleneck, it showed that although Luo Fan seemed to have great magical powers, he could still use the scene of Lunatic Swordsman's creation to improve his own cultivation realm, allowing the power of his magical powers to continue to improve. In other words, at this moment, Luo Fan still hadn't reached his limit. He naturally wouldn't let go of this kind of progress that only needed to be accumulated over time. Therefore, it was very natural for him to have this kind of performance. Luo Fan floated in front of the 3D rune sphere. He raised his hand and pointed at the 3D rune sphere. Infinite magic power units rushed out of his fingers and turned into a long river that poured into the 3D rune sphere. They constantly changed the essence of the 3D rune sphere, causing it to gradually change. 100 years later, the whole 3D rune sphere shook, and the contraction that was like breathing, like the beating of a heart, suddenly stopped. After that, boundless light shot out from the sphere. These light rays had infinite penetrating power and were endless. In an instant, they covered all the worlds inside the everlasting Void Palace, and even the materials of the entire everlasting Void Palace, enveloping the entire everlasting Void Palace. In this light, the 3D rune sphere gradually changed shape, and the 3D rune that made up the entire sphere underwent an earth-shaking change. The extremely stable threads of vitality, which were originally the smallest units of the 3D rune, directly turned into extremely tiny magic power units. The magical power unit was a three-dimensional talisman that was extremely mysterious, complicated, and contained infinite power. After Luo Fan attained the Zenith Heaven Dao fruit, this 3D rune had reached an indescribable state. The mystery contained in it was even deep enough to break the spirit, memory, and mind of any cultivator who hadn't attained the Zenith Heaven Dao fruit. Compared to the 3D rune sphere that made up the 3D rune sphere, this kind of 3D rune was countless times more profound and mysterious. In this case, the replacement of the vitality threads by these magic power units naturally couldn't be piled up together to form thread. That way, it would be like using diamonds to form a wand. These magic power units replaced the vitality threads in a way that couldn't be described with word. This method caused every magic power unit to undergo a mysterious change. This change couldn't be described with words. It was only known that after this change, every magic power unit could directly replace a vitality thread, no matter how long it was. And these magic power units that replaced the vitality threads were then connected and recombined through some indescribable method. In the end, they formed a 3D rune sphere that was rather crude compared to the magic power unit. Then, these 3D rune spheres were used to construct the 3D rune sphere. After this change, the volume of the 3D rune sphere shrank to a diameter of 3 feet. It was more than 10 times smaller than before. Although it had shrunk, the aura and power that it emitted were hundreds of times stronger than before. Because of this, its sense of existence was also many times stronger. It was even to the extent that the connection between it and the outside world seemed to have become less close. Obviously, this 3D rune sphere, or rather, the core of the Void Wuji Palace, had been completely transformed by Luo Fan during this process. The weakness of being too close to the primordial world had been made up for. However, even so, Luo Fan still didn't stop moving. Endless magic power units were still gushing out of his fingers and continuously pouring into the 3D rune sphere. But this time, these magic power units did not replace the foundation of the three-dimensional rune sphere. Instead, through some mysterious transformation, they fused with the billions of rays of light emitted by the three-dimensional rune sphere. These rays of light spread inside and outside of the everlasting Void Palace, constantly fusing with the limitless Void Palace, and then fusing with the limitless Void Palace, and then fusing with the limitless Void Palace. Along with this change, in an extremely mysterious place in the endless starry sky, where the Void Wuji Palace was located, strands of strange materials were continuously thrown out. They were either washed away by the star essence and turned invisible, or condensed in one place and fell into the primordial world through some mysterious method. Every single one of these materials was an incomparably precious heavenly material and earthly treasure even in the primordial world. If any cultivator obtained them, it would be an incredible opportunity. But at this moment, they could only be discharged from the void Wuji Palace like excrement. Time passed. In the blink of an eye, 100 billion years had passed in the void Wuji Palace. From the time Luo Fan was subjected to the power of deprivation from the supreme great Tao of the primordial world until now, more than 110 billion years had passed in the void Wuji Palace. This period of time seemed very long, but in fact, to the primordial world, it was only a dozen yuanhui. Compared to more than 100 yuanhui, it was not even 1/10 of the time. Chapter 665. Somewhere in the depths of the endless starry sky, the place where the Wuji Palace and the untainted land had merged with each other emitted faint wisps of light all the time. These specks of light were extremely mysterious. Although they were just specks of light, they contained an aura that could not be destroyed. It was as if they had existed since the beginning of the world and would exist eternally. No power or change could shake these specks of light, nor could they change the form of existence of these specks of light. It was this unbreakable aura that made these rays of light, although not strong, and could even be regarded as weak in general, have an unimaginable penetrating power. They could directly penetrate the infinite void, the endless starry sky, and the 9 layers of heavenly gang lightning fire in the untainted land, shining in the untainted land. As long as the living beings in the untainted land had a strong eyesight, they could easily see the existence of these wisps of light. They could see a medium-sized nebula of wisps of light in the endless starry sky. In the center of the wisps of light, in the dozens of yuanhui, various substances were emitted from it at every moment. This chapter is provided for you when these substances were first expelled. They were just tiny particles that were almost undetectable with the naked eye. But when they were expelled out of the range of the scattered light, under the effect of some mysterious rules, they either scattered in all directions or continuously condensed, gradually turning into all kinds of tangible objects that were as large as mountains and rocks that could be seen with the naked eye. These objects were extremely mysterious. Any one of them was an extremely rare heavenly material and earthly treasure even in the untainted land at this time. Moreover, they contained some indescribable mysteries. They coincided with the supreme great Tao and recorded all kinds of unfathomable truth. If a cultivator obtained these substances, he would be able to understand many truths that he did not know before, and could even easily break through the bottleneck in the past. These substances flew in all directions without a fixed direction. However, under the guidance of the wisps of light, many of them broke through the barrier between the endless starry sky and the untainted land, broke through the layers of wind, lightning, and fire, and landed on the untainted land. These substances were so mysterious that it was impossible for them to be worn away by the astral wind, lightning, and fire. In fact, after entering the primordial world, they could even attract endless primordial chi to gather on them, creating all sorts of incredible phenomena. Therefore, every time these substances broke through the barrier and stepped into the primordial world, it was like a group of stars descending. Heavenly marks streaked across the sky, allowing almost all living beings to see their existence. This situation, combined with the unfathomable principles recorded in these substances, and the fact that they could even help some cultivators break through their bottlenecks and improve their cultivation greatly, caused countless fights and bloodshed every time these substances set foot in the untainted land. Everything in the primordial world was under the control of the supreme great Tao. These materials, which contained all kinds of profound mysteries, were rare treasures of heaven and earth, and they were naturally no exception. Under the guidance of some unpredictable rules, the way these substances entered the primordial world unknowingly coincided with some inexplicable rules. The time it took for the substances to break through the barrier between the endless starry sky and the primordial world gradually stabilized at a period of 1,296 years. The substances formed during this period of time piled up outside the primordial world under the influence of this rule and condensed a second time, forming fewer, more profound, and more precious treasures of heaven and earth. Only when they reached a certain age did they break through the barrier and descend into the primordial world. Moreover, the location where these substances descended into the primordial world had unknowingly been fixed. It was on an island with a radius of tens of millions of kilometers in the East Ocean of the primordial world. And because of the arrival of these substances, this island was distinguished from the countless other islands, and it had a name: Treasure-Splitting Island. Every 1,296 years, various kinds of miraculous treasures of heaven and earth would descend from the sky through some mysterious method. They streaked across half of the primordial world and directly landed on the treasure-splitting island, scattering in all directions. Thus, every 1,296 years, countless cultivators would rush to this treasure island from all directions and carry out countless battles on it, causing countless rains of blood to arise as they fought for the treasures that descended from the sky. From the appearance of the first treasure until now, this situation had already happened more than 100 times. The number of cultivators that died on it had also reached the level of millions. On this day, it was another 1,296 years when a rare treasure descended from the sky. Early in the morning, there were hundreds of thousands of cultivators gathered on the treasure-splitting island. They occupied various areas of the island according to the various forces, waiting for the arrival of the feast that occurred in the sky every 1,296 years. Although there were thousands of forces, they were generally divided into two camps: the human camp and the demon camp. Moreover, the strength between the two camps was equal, and they hated each other. Although there were countless disputes within their respective camps, and even endless hatred between them, if they encountered the other camp, they would definitely put aside their hatred for the time being and unite against a common enemy. They would only fight amongst themselves after the enemy camp was taken care of. The two camps each occupied one side of the treasure-splitting island. There was not much difference in the area that they occupied. This clearly meant that the strength of the human camp and the demon camp was equal, and no one could suppress the other. Sky Demon King, you had the upper hand in the last treasure-splitting, but this time you won't be so lucky. The few spots with the highest probability of getting the treasures are all occupied by us. I think your harvest this time is quite worrying. Why don't you retreat, lest you get punished by the higher-ups for your incompetence? Above the Treasure Division Island, an incomparably tyrannical will burst out from the center of the human race camp, rushing straight towards the demon race camp without any concealment. Looking at the way it rushed, it seemed that it wanted to completely wipe out the demon race camp. This will was so powerful that it almost condensed into a substance, enough to interfere with reality. The person who could send out this will had at least touched the threshold of the golden immortal realm. In other words, without the cultivation of a half-step golden immortal realm, it was absolutely impossible to send out such a will. If the will of the half-step golden immortal realm pressed down without any resistance, even if there were many itinerant immortals and true immortals in the demon clan's camp, they would suffer heavy losses. It was impossible for them to be completely annihilated, but more than half of them would definitely die. However, despite such danger, the monster cultivators in the demon camp below, no matter how strong or weak they were, didn't care about this will at all. Instead, they continued to do what they were doing, working hard to occupy the spots that had the most treasures in the past. They thought that the treasures were most likely to appear. It was as if they knew that no matter how strong this will was, it would not be able to hurt them. Sure enough, at the instant when this will was about to press down, an even more powerful will that contained a demonic aura soared into the sky from the center of the demon camp and collided with this will. Zhu Xingzi, aren't you being complacent too early? You should know that there's no pattern to the treasures that descended from the sky. The spot that had the most treasures the last time might be the spot that had the least treasures the next time. It's not like this hasn't happened before. Are you sure it won't be like that this time? I think you should worry about yourself. With your bad luck, when have you ever been able to win against us? I think you probably won't be able to lead the human camp to the treasure-splitting island after this. Ha ha! This will contain boundless arrogance, overbearingness, and demonic aura. Its strength was not inferior to the will that was sent out by the human camp earlier. Obviously, it was sent out by a demon clan expert that was at least in the half-step golden immortal realm. Two wills that were capable of interfering with reality collided in midair, and an earth-shaking rumble instantly erupted. When one's cultivation realm reached the golden immortal realm, one's comprehension of the Grand Tao was sufficient to allow one to possess the ability to break through the void of the primordial world. It had been said in the past that the space of the primordial world was extremely mysterious. If one hadn't attained the golden immortal realm, then no matter how strong one's strength was, if one's comprehension of the supreme Grand Tao was insufficient, then one wouldn't be able to affect the space of the primordial world and cause the slightest change in the void of the primordial world. Although these two wills were only at the half-step golden immortal realm, they had come into contact with the power of the golden immortal realm after all, so they were barely able to affect the void of the primordial world. As a result, when the two wills collided, the space around them began to distort violently. Countless thunderclaps spread out in all directions from the point of impact. The entire treasure-divided island trembled slightly, as if there was a powerful earthquake. However, they were only at the half-step golden immortal realm after all. Their ability to affect the void of the primordial world was extremely weak. Although they caused countless tremors and caused the space to distort, they didn't even cause a single crack in the space. The space was still incomparably complete, and the incomparably complete space's ability to repair all kinds of phenomena was naturally extremely powerful. Therefore, when the sound of the collision was still spreading in the void, the space had already been smoothed out, and all abnormalities had already disappeared. Zhu Xingzi and the Sky Demon King had already fought against each other countless times. They were already familiar with each other, so they wouldn't pester each other. Therefore, they tested each other, and after discovering that the other's progress was similar to theirs, they no longer pestered each other. They both snorted coldly, retracted their wills, and quietly waited for the treasure to descend from the sky. The process of waiting was the longest. But no matter how long it was, time would always pass. Unknowingly, it was already noon. When the sun reached the highest point in the sky, it was also the time when the treasure descended from the sky. At this moment, billions of rays of light suddenly shone through the astral wind, lightning, and fire layer. They directly shone down, dyeing the entire sky with various colors. It looked extremely gorgeous and mysterious. At this moment, all the cultivators on the treasure-splitting island exclaimed in their hearts, "It's finally here!" Then, rays of light tore through the void and broke through the astral wind, lightning, and fire layer. From all directions of the primordial world, they rushed towards the treasure-splitting island at an unimaginable speed. These lights were extremely bright. Almost every inch of the void in the entire primordial world could easily see the existence of these lights and sense the trajectory of these lights. Faintly, there seemed to be an unparalleled force wrapped around these lights, causing these lights to condense into various grand, exquisite, mysterious, dangerous, or beautiful strange shadows in the void. The unparalleled force was extremely mysterious. It was the manifestation of some mysterious rule of the primordial world. This rule made it impossible for these lights to be intercepted before they reached the treasure-splitting island. Only when they reached a certain height above the treasure-splitting island would the unparalleled force disappear, allowing these lights to be collected and intercepted. It was precisely because of the existence of this unparalleled force that these lights could reach the treasure-splitting island. Otherwise, with so many experts in the primordial world, how could they easily walk through more than half of the primordial world and finally arrive at the treasure-splitting island for everyone to fight over? And the various shadows that the light condensed in the void were the external manifestations of the mysterious treasures contained within the light. It was because the mysteries contained within the treasures combined with some kind of rule of the outside world to produce a phenomenon. Through these phenomena, one would be able to roughly know exactly how precious the precious treasure within the light was and what aspect it was related to. It was even to the extent that one would be able to discern exactly which cultivator it was fated with, and this was the basis for the numerous cultivators on the treasure split island to fight for it. There are actually 1,296 of them. This is 10 times more than the last time, and it is the largest number in history. Looks like the treasures that fell from the sky this time might be very different from the past. At this moment, similar thoughts flashed through the minds of the heavenly demon king and Zhu Xingzi. The two of them were not the strongest in the cultivation world of the entire untainted land, but they were a little bit close to the strongest level. More importantly, the two of them were existences with outstanding intelligence and extremely sharp reactions. If not, they would not have been sent to this treasure-splitting island to control the battle between the two camps. This treasure-splitting island might not be much to the entire human clan and demon clan. Even these treasures that fell from the sky were not particularly precious in the eyes of the top cultivators. However, after all, it was a battle between the two camps. It represented the strength of the two clans, so they naturally could not ignore it. If they were not intelligent, they would definitely not be able to bear the responsibility of leadership. The fact that they were sent here meant that the two of them were intelligent. Because of this, the two of them felt the uniqueness of the treasures that fell from the sky the moment they counted the lights. They even had various guesses in an instant. Perhaps this will be the last time the treasures will fall from the sky. With this thought in mind, the two of them naturally made up their minds. They wanted to obtain victory in this last chance and suppress the other party. Therefore, the two of them rushed out from where they were originally waiting at almost the same time and directly headed towards the place where the lights came from. The other people might not think as much as the two of them, but they had waited here for so long and they were not here to play. Seeing someone fly up, they naturally did not show any weakness. In an instant, the entire treasure-splitting island was instantly filled with hundreds of thousands of lights. The sky was instantly filled with these hundreds of thousands of lights. 1,296 rays of light that represented the strange treasures streaked across most of the chaos wasteland at an unimaginable speed, leaving behind incomparably conspicuous trajectories in the void. Like the eye of a whirlpool, they directly blasted through the hundreds of thousands of cultivators' escape lights, scattering and descending to various parts of the treasure-divided island. The hundreds of thousands of cultivators that came to this treasure-splitting island were strong and weak. Among them, the strong ones like Zhu Xingzi and the Sky Demon King had the strength of a half-step golden immortal. The weak ones had not even reached the scattered immortal realm. As a result, only a very small number of cultivators were able to intercept these treasures the instant the boundless power around the light disappeared. Zhu Xingzi and the Sky Demon King were naturally among them. And every time a treasure fell from the sky, there would definitely be the strongest and most precious treasure. Since this treasure was the most precious and the strongest, the light around it was naturally the most mysterious and vast. This was definitely not difficult to recognize. Not to mention the Sky Demon King and Zhu Xingzi, almost any cultivator with a bit of eyesight would be able to notice the existence of this treasure. Because of this, the moment the treasure stepped into the sky above the treasure-splitting island, Zhu Xingzi and the Sky Demon King clashed directly. Unparalleled power impact, all sorts of incredible spells, powerful magic artifacts, and magic treasures instantly clashed together. The entire sky was instantly filled with endless light. Haha, the strongest treasure this time actually contains the mysteries of the sky. If it can be used as the core, I'm afraid I can easily open up a medium-sized world. Zhu Xingzi, you're unlucky this time. The Sky Demon King was closer to the treasure, so he recognized the mysteries of the treasure even faster. He couldn't help but exclaim in joy. It's not certain who will win in the end. Maybe you're unlucky this time. Zhu Xingzi smiled faintly. As the two of them spoke, they began to fight fiercely around the treasure. Both of them were half a step into golden immortal realm. Neither of them could suppress the other, so the battle was naturally very exciting. In an instant the sky collapsed and the earth cracked. The aftermath of the battle was enough to distort the void. However, the cultivators who were close to the battlefield couldn't resist the aftermath of the battle. In an instant, thousands of cultivators were wiped out by the aftermath of the battle. Among the cultivators wiped out by the aftermath of the battle, there were monster race cultivators and human race cultivators. Among them, there were even perfected immortal realm cultivators who were just a bit weaker than the two of them. This treasure records the mysteries of the creation of the sky and earth. It's the most precious treasure that has descended from the sky over the past hundreds of times. This treasure is indeed very special. If I fail, I might never be able to make a comeback. No matter what, I can't lose. This thought flashed through the minds of Zhu Xingzi and the Sky Demon King at the same time. The two of them had such thoughts, and it was destined that the blood in this fight would be denser than any other time in the past. Chapter 666. Just as the two camps of the human clan and the demon clan were preparing to set off the bloodiest battle in history on the treasure-divided island, in a mysterious location in the endless starry sky, the center of the endless light was undergoing a huge change that was not inferior to the one that was about to occur on the treasure-divided island below. Text first. The intensity of the endless light skyrocketed. From its originally faint and visible state, it became as dazzling as the sun. The originally extremely stable characteristics directly changed, turning into an extremely violent and active form. Following this change, an endless amount of matter gushed out from the inside of the light in an unimaginable manner. The speed at which these substances gushed out was millions of times faster than the unhurried speed in the past. If it was said to be like a water faucet in the past, then at this moment it was like a galaxy that hung high in the sky. Under this kind of spewing speed, the area enveloped by the light shrank at an unimaginable speed. After the various matters that spewed out from the light gushed out, they scattered in all directions. In the process of flying away, they quickly condensed, gradually forming pieces after pieces of heaven and earth treasures that contained all kinds of inconceivable mysteries. They either shot towards the depths of the endless starry sky in the distance, or towards the primordial world not far away. Needless to say, the matters that shot towards the depths of the endless starry sky could only float in the endless starry sky. Perhaps one day, they could meet a cultivator roaming the starry sky and collect them, or they could be captured by a star and fused with it. Apart from this, there was no fourth possibility. As for the treasures of heaven and earth that gathered towards the primordial world, they were affected by some kind of law during this process. They began to gather for the second, third, fourth time, and finally reached an infinite number of times. Every time they gathered, the amount of these matters would greatly decrease. There were also various other impurities that were removed from them, causing the volume of these matters to not increase too much due to this kind of gathering. In the end, when the matters shot out of the primordial world and collided with the countless matters that had accumulated there for the past 1,296 years, these matters had already undergone millions of times of fusion and reorganization. And when these matters collided with the matters that originally existed here, they began the final fusion and reorganization. Although these matters that were left here had endured the mysteries of the primordial world for more than 1,000 years, in terms of mysteriousness, they were still far inferior to these matters that had experienced tens of thousands of times of fusion and reorganization. Thus, the fusion and recombination of the two ultimately relied on external substances as the foundation. These materials that were originally left here could only be used as supplement. Therefore, in the end, the last fusion and reorganization caused an extremely small change to all matter. It only stabilized the number of all matter at an extremely mysterious number in the primordial world. That number was 1296. When these substances stabilized, the 1296-year interval would be up. Thus, these 1296 items that had transformed into some sort of rare treasure directly broke through the boundary between the boundless starry sky and the primordial world, and they rumbled into the primordial world. They passed through the layer of astral winds, lightning and flames, and they headed towards the treasure-divided island from all directions. Thus, it caused the thickest abnormal blood in the history of the treasure-divided island. At the same time, it also became the fuse of another, more tragic war. Let's not talk about the various changes in the primordial world. Let's talk about the mysterious and unfathomable location in the endless starry sky, where the light was. The place that the light originally enveloped was an extremely vast space that could not even be described with words. However, when the changes that occurred to the light stabilized, the light became as stable as before, unshakable, and soothing as before. The space that the light enveloped had already shrunk to the size of a normal person's palm. The difference between the size of a normal person's palm and an extremely vast space that could not even be described with words was so huge that it simply exceeded the imagination of all living beings. However, this extreme disparity had appeared right here. Moreover, the entire process was so short that it was beyond imagination. In just a few dozen breaths, this earth-shattering change had been completed. During this process, the amount of matter that spewed out from the light was enough to fill a continent with a radius of billions of kilometers. In the end, most of the matter that spewed out only condensed into 1296 heaven and earth treasures. The largest was only a few dozen feet in diameter, and the smallest was only the size of a needle tip. From this, it could be seen how precious the 1296 heaven and earth treasures were. At the same time, it could also be seen how profound the process of the light's transformation was. When this change subsided, the light gradually faded, and the true appearance of the palm-sized matter was finally revealed. It was a group of palaces. This group of palaces was arranged on a circular, palm-sized plate. It seemed to be real, but in reality, it was constructed from countless complicated and profound three-dimensional auxiliary talismans. There were 3001 palaces in the group of palaces. They were connected to each other in some mysterious way, finally forming an extremely profound whole. It seemed to be some kind of formation, but it also seemed to be the traces of the Great Tao. It even seemed to be the manifestation of the Supreme Great Tao. When they were combined, they gave off an aura that even the world could not shake. It was as if even if the entire world was destroyed, it would not affect them at all. This group of palaces appeared on the palm-sized plate, so one could imagine its size. However, every palace was concrete. All the details that a palace should have existed in them. Every detail was so perfect and every detail was so real. If one only paid attention to these palaces and ignored their size, no living being would be able to discover that they were actually palaces that had been shrunk on a palm-sized plate. However, the gaps between this group of palaces were not empty. Instead, they were surrounded by some kind of earthy existence. This existence was like yellow soil. At first glance, it looked like a piece of land, but as long as one took a closer look, they would find that these earthy existences were very mysterious. They even contained supreme divine might that could destroy everything. These were the earth thunder that was formed after a certain kind of thunder had been tempered countless times, purified countless times, and improved countless times. It was the purest and most condensed earth thunder. After going through countless changes, this earth thunder had turned from the original nothingness into a solid. At this moment, the solid formed by this earth thunder was billions of times harder than diamond. Even if the void was destroyed, even if time and space collapsed, it would not be damaged at all. Although this earth thunder looked like it could only cover the palm-sized plate, In reality, if it were to spread out, it would be enough to drown the land within a radius of a few trillion miles. And it was not just a shallow drowning, but the kind that could drown the land dozens of miles deep. This plate naturally could not be anything else. It was the Void Wuji Palace that had been refined and changed. At this moment, the Void Wuji Palace was floating in a mysterious position in the endless starry sky. It looked extremely ordinary and simple, but in reality, it was beyond the world and beyond the great Tao. Although it was here, it was not affected by any matter in the outside world, not even the supreme great Tao. It was as if it had been completely cut off from the outside world and the supreme great Tao. That was the truth. The changes that had happened to the Void Wuji Palace during the hundreds of periods in the primordial world were the process of Luo Fan's refinement of the Void Wuji Palace. This kind of refinement was not the same as before, where countless treasures of heaven and earth were added to it to increase the power of the Void Wuji Palace. Instead, it was a kind of refinement to cut off all the connections between the Void Wuji Palace and the primordial world, as well as all the entanglements with the Supreme Great Tao. Because the purpose of this kind of refinement was so different from the previous kind of refinement, Luo Fan did not integrate any treasures of heaven and earth into it. Instead, he kept stripping away the countless treasures of heaven and earth that he had integrated into the magic treasure during the process of refining the Void Wuji Palace and kept eliminating them. It was precisely because of this that countless treasures of heaven and earth constantly left the location of the Void Wuji Palace over the hundreds of periods and rushed towards the endless starry sky and the primordial world. One had to know that when Luo Fan first refined this magic treasure, he had only used a material that could be found everywhere in the primordial world at that time. However, in order to refine this magic treasure, he had gone into the sky and almost exhausted the entire void. He had integrated treasures of heaven and earth that could fill several continents into it. Because of this, it was naturally a huge project to strip away all the treasures of heaven and earth that had been integrated into it. If he wanted to maintain the mysteries of this magic treasure during the stripping process, the project would naturally be even greater and more difficult. That was why he had to spend over 100 yuan hui to successfully accomplish this. As for the mysteries, principles, and mysteries contained in the materials that had been stripped out, they were naturally the principles, mysteries, and mysteries that the Dharma treasure had obtained from the supreme great Tao of the primordial world every moment it breathed and exhaled over the years. These principles, mysteries, and profundities had endless power. For any living being, even for Luo Fan, they had countless benefits. They could allow their cultivation base to increase more or less because of comprehending these things. However, their existence would become an obstacle for the Void Wuji Palace to break away from the shackles of the primordial world and become completely independent. The connection between the primordial world and the primordial world was not just material. The entanglement between the Void Wuji Palace and the primordial world was naturally not just about the various treasures of heaven and earth that had been integrated into it. It also included the various principles, mysteries, and mysteries contained in the supreme great Tao of the primordial world. If one only stripped away the treasures of heaven and earth without stripping away the principles, mysteries, and mysteries, it would be equivalent to taking off the clothes on the surface. There would still be no change inside. In essence, the connection with the primordial world would still be similar to before. Only by completely stripping away these principles, mysteries, and mysteries could one truly cut off this connection. Therefore, although the principles, mysteries, and mysteries that had been stripped from the Void Wuji Palace and attached to the treasures of heaven and earth were not beneficial to the Void Wuji Palace, it did not mean that they were useless. On the contrary, they were unimaginably precious existences to any cultivator. If any cultivator could obtain any of them, they would be able to guide the direction of their cultivation, allowing their cultivation realm to increase more or less. It was precisely because of these reasons that the materials that had been stripped from the Void Wuji Palace could have so many changes. They could also cause so many cultivators in the primordial world to compete fiercely for them. At this moment, inside the Void Wuji Palace, the strange palace had undergone an earth-shattering change. The appearance of the hall had completely changed. It looked like the void of the universe, and there was nothing in the surroundings or above it. It was just a boundless void. Below the palace there was an invisible barrier. In the boundless, thick yellow land, there were 3,001 majestic palaces that exuded all kinds of mysterious auras. They seemed to be simple and inexplicable. They formed a whole in an extremely incredible way. This whole body was extremely mysterious. It seemed to contain all the mysteries of the universe and all the principles of the Supreme Great Tao. These palaces were the 3,000 minor kiliacosms and 1 medium kiliacosm. And that boundless, incomparably thick yellow soil was the solid ground of the earth element lightning. At this moment, in front of Luo Fan, there was a three-dimensional talisman seal sphere with a diameter of 3 feet. This sphere was the core of the Void Wuji Palace. It was also the Void Wuji Palace technique that Luo Fan had modified countless times. The sphere rotated slowly in front of him. Every time it rotated, it seemed to pull the entire Void Wuji Palace to produce some kind of inexplicable change. It caused the boundless yellow land in the 3,001 worlds below to change slightly, as if they were resonating with each other at any time. At this moment, Luo Fan was still pointing at the sphere with his right hand. However, there were no more Dharma power units coming out of his fingers. His eyes seemed to be open and closed at the same time. His eyes seemed to contain 2 extremely deep universes, and heaven and earth. In his mind, the mysteries that floated out of the mental particles had stopped at some point in time. At the same time, his mind was surging with countless rays of light. Countless lights, shadows, words, runes, talismans, patterns, and diagrams were surging in his mind. After an unknown amount of time, these strange phenomena gradually calmed down. His mind finally became completely calm. There was only a clear light of enlightenment that shrouded everything. I've finally reached the peak. How long did it take this time? Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes, put down his right hand, and sighed. For any cultivator who could freely enter and exit the meditative realm, how long it took to enter the meditative realm was not a problem. This was naturally the same for Luo Fan. With just a thought, he instantly understood that it had taken him 100 billion years to comprehend all the mysteries of the grand Luo scattered Tao realm contained in the scene of the creation of heaven and earth. So it was 100 billion years. My guess was right. After understanding how long it had taken, Luo Fan did not feel emotional because of the long time. Instead, he felt a sense of satisfaction that everything had gone according to his expectations. 100 billion years might have been an extremely long period of time for Luo Fan in the past. It was enough for him to feel as if countless lifetimes had passed. However, to him, who had cultivated for trillions of years, 100 billion years could only be considered a relatively long period of time. Just the length of 100 billion years could no longer trigger the changes in his emotions like before, nor could it make him feel like the world had changed. In other words, the current Luo Fan was getting more and more accustomed to the changes brought about by eternal life. After experiencing 100 billion years of comprehension, Luo Fan's cultivation had risen to the peak of the Daluo scattered Tao realm. At this moment, he only lacked the last opportunity and the last bit of comprehension to break through the barrier between the Daluo scattered Tao realm and the Daluo true Tao realm and reach the Daluo true Tao realm. However, it was obvious that after he fell out with the primordial world, the legendary opportunity was almost impossible for him to appear again. In other words, to the current Luo Fan, the barrier that could originally be crossed with just a slight lift of his foot was unimaginably sturdy. Only by relying on the cultivation of endless time and the comprehension of endless time could he advance his Tao bit by bit. Only then could he break through this barrier. It was impossible for him to suddenly obtain some enlightenment from the primordial world on a whim like in the past and break through this barrier. This was not difficult to understand. In fact, opportunities were formed by special conditions in the outside world. A special environment had a special effect on a special person at a special time. In other words, opportunities were formed by the special care of the world and the supreme great Tao for a special person. To Luo Fan, the primordial world even wanted to deprive him of all the gains he had obtained in the past. How could it create any special environment and special conditions to give Luo Fan opportunities? Regarding this point, Luo Fan was clearer than anyone else. However, he did not have the slightest regret for his previous actions. If he could do it all over again, he would still do the same thing. He would never change. Chapter 667. Although the lack of opportunities would make his path of breakthrough extremely bumpy, in this way, as long as he obtained something, it would be his true gain. It could no longer be taken away by any existence, not even the supreme great Tao of the primordial world. In other words, although he did not have the opportunity to instantly obtain extraordinary progress, he had eliminated the original hidden dangers, making it smoother and easier for him to transcend the primordial world in the future. First posted to Luo Fan, transcending the primordial world was still extremely far away. It was so far that he could not see any trace of its existence even if he looked into the distance. However, when he attained the zenith heaven Tao fruit, he had already stepped onto the path to transcend the primordial world. There were 4 great Tao fruits in the Tao fruit Tao: Earth Immortal Tao fruit, Grand Unity Tao fruit, Zenith Tao fruit, and Hun Essence Tao fruit. Amongst them, attaining the earthly immortal Tao fruit would allow one to transcend life and death and possess eternal life. After a cultivator attains the earthly immortal Tao fruit, time would lose its most formidable might. The primordial unity Tao fruit would allow the cultivator's divine abilities to be infinitely more powerful. In the end, the cultivator would gain supreme divine abilities and boundless power, and would be able to protect the body for eternity. On the other hand, the all-heaven Tao fruit allowed a cultivator to be independent, self-sufficient, and not seek external help. At this stage, the relationship between a cultivator and the outside world had changed from a dependent relationship to an independent one. At this realm, all changes in the outside world no longer had any meaning to cultivators. As long as heaven and earth were not destroyed and the universe was not destroyed, cultivators would not die. Cultivators who had attained this level of cultivation were already completely separated from other living beings, and they could no longer be treated like other living beings. From this, it could be inferred that amongst the innumerable powers and divine abilities of the essence of Hun Dao fruit, there was at least one that could allow cultivators to transcend the primordial world and move freely within the chaotic state of Hun. They wouldn't be shackled by the heavens and the earth any longer, and they would truly be immortal, indestructible, and indestructible. Therefore, the zenith heaven Tao fruit was the last realm before transcending the primordial world. Under such circumstances, attaining the zenith heaven Tao fruit was equivalent to embarking on the path of pursuing the eternal goal of transcending the primordial world. This was just like a student trying to get into high school. No matter what their intentions were, no matter whether they had a goal or not, they were ultimately studying and working hard to get into a university. Although Luo Fan was only at the zenith heaven dispersing Tao realm, he had already reached the point where he needed to consider transcending the primordial world in the future. It had also reached the point where he could abandon some convenience for the sake of the difficulty of transcending the primordial world in the future. Luo Fan floated in the air. His mind was not disturbed by the fact that he was stuck in a bottleneck and could not find a way out. He thought for a moment and shouted, "What are you waiting for?" Following his shout, the entire Wuji palace shook slightly, as if a giant had suddenly awakened from his sleep. An indescribable vitality was born out of thin air, and it quickly condensed towards the three-dimensional rune sphere in front of Luo Fan. As the vitality condensed, the three-dimensional rune ball shook slightly and gradually transformed from its original solid form into a 5- or 6-year-old boy. After the boy appeared, he bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Limitless boy, thanks master for your help." This boy was the limitless boy after the transformation. Luo Fan had reforged the entire limitless void palace and removed all the heavenly materials and earthly treasures obtained from the untainted world. As the treasure spirit of the limitless void palace, the limitless boy would naturally change accordingly. Although the limitless boy looked much smaller than before, in fact, the power of his mystical abilities, his control over the entire Wuji palace, and his spiritual consciousness had all improved beyond imagination. At this moment, his eyes were several times more spirited than before. Although he still hadn't developed his own consciousness, he already possessed everything that an ordinary living being should possess. Even this self-consciousness was faintly brewing. After an unknown period of time, or perhaps it would be activated by some mechanism, it would be able to produce a complete self-consciousness, and then become a true living being with the possibility of self-cultivation. The reason why the limitless boy thanked Luo Fan was because of this. Luo Fan's expression was calm as he said, "Get up. The reconstruction of this palace is only the first step. You've barely stepped into the primordial unity treasure realm, but you haven't reached the level where you can help me." The limitless boy stood up and said with shame, "Limitless boy's strength is limited. I can't help master. I'm really ashamed." Although he did not have self-consciousness, he had everything that a normal living being had except self-consciousness. Naturally, he knew when to say what to say. Luo Fan did not respond to the limitless boy's words. He raised his hand and pointed. There seemed to be some strange existence flowing through the limitless boy's body. As these strange existences flowed through his body, the limitless boy shook slightly. His eyes suddenly flashed with dazzling light of wisdom. There seemed to be countless complex and mysterious three-dimensional runes pouring down from his pupils like the Milky Way falling from the ninth heaven. After a few breaths, this change stopped. When this change stopped, the limitless boy bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Limitless boy understands." With that, he took a step forward and disappeared into the void. As the limitless boy disappeared into the void, the boundless yellow land below began to tumble violently. After an unknown period of time, 2 dragon cries suddenly came from the depths of the yellow land. These 2 dragon cries contained boundless might and power. The moment it came out, it spread through the entire 3001 worlds inside the limitless palace. It even passed through the limitless palace and radiated to the endless starry sky. These 2 dragon cries became louder and louder, but the power contained in them gradually converged and turned into an indescribable vicissitude. This vicissitude was far beyond the imagination of all living beings. It was like an ordinary mortal who had experienced hundreds of trillions of years, seen the vicissitudes of the world, the changes of the universe, and the vicissitudes of the world. This vicissitude gradually weakened with the passage of time, and finally disappeared completely. As the vicissitudes disappeared, the 2 dragon cries also gradually weakened. In the end, they disappeared without a trace, as if they had never appeared. When the dragon's voice disappeared, a pair of golden scissors appeared above the yellow land below, above the 3001 palaces. This pair of scissors was inexplicably ancient, as if it was forged from some kind of gold and copper. There were even specks of rust on it. If it wasn't for the fact that it was floating in the air, no living being would be able to tell that this pair of scissors was different from ordinary scissors used by ordinary people. At most, they would feel that this pair of scissors was too big. A pair of scissors that was a few meters long was not something that ordinary people could use. But that was all. This pair of scissors floated in the void, as if it was the center of the universe. It was as if everything in the universe was suppressed by this pair of scissors, and even feared this pair of scissors. Around this pair of scissors, the void stopped moving, and time seemed to be cut off by it. A strange space-time fault appeared around the pair of scissors, causing the pair of scissors to gradually become a little blurred, as if it was about to disappear from this space-time. It seems like a long time has passed. A leisurely sigh came from the pair of scissors. Then, the pair of scissors swayed slightly and turned into a figure. This person's appearance was handsome. It was hard to tell whether he was a man or a woman, but regardless of whether it was a man or a woman, they would feel that his body was emitting an attractive aura, making them involuntarily have a good impression of him. This figure floated in the void, looked around, and finally saw Luo Fan above. He raised his head and looked at Luo Fan high in the sky, and the expression in his eyes was quite complicated. There was an indescribable vicissitudes of life, and an inexplicable feeling, but at the same time, there seemed to be some dissatisfaction. After a while, this person sighed again and bowed to Luo Fan. After that, he stood up, shook his body, and instantly turned into two figures. These two figures were a man and a woman. The man was majestic and tall, and his body was surrounded by an indescribable powerful aura. It was as if he could shatter the void and destroy the world with just a wave of his hand. The woman was petite and beautiful, and her appearance was extremely beautiful. Her body was surrounded by an incomparably strong holy aura, enough to suppress all negative emotions in the surroundings. These two people were Ao Lai and Ao Yin, the two Jiao dragons who cultivated the golden Jiao dragon transformation Tao that Luo Fan taught them. After Ao Lai and Ao Yin appeared, their eyes were full of confusion. After a long time, they regained their clarity and looked around, and finally, it turned into endless joy. The two held each other's hands tightly, and almost at the same time said, "At last, it's complete! At last, we can live forever!" Then, they both laughed loudly. After a long time, the two gradually calmed down, and only then did they notice Luo Fan standing in the void above. As soon as the two saw Luo Fan, they were shocked and didn't dare to hesitate. They each took a step forward, and with a slight ripple in the void, they directly appeared in front of Luo Fan and stepped on the seemingly invisible barrier. The two were quite surprised by their surroundings, but they didn't say anything. They just knelt to Luo Fan and said, "Ao Lai Yin greets Master, many thanks for your help." Luo Fan smiled and raised his hand to help them up. He said, "No need to be so polite. The two of you can have today's achievements because of your luck. Even if you have no self, you can still achieve immortality." At this moment, Luo Fan's cultivation realm was extremely high. With a single thought, his every movement was the great Tao. Although he only raised his hand to help them up, there was boundless profundity in it, allowing Ao Lai and Ao Yin to stand up in an incomparably natural manner. The entire process was completely out of Ao Lai and Ao Yin's control, but it was as if they wanted to stand up on their own. There was not the slightest bit of reluctance, and there was not the slightest trace of compulsion. The principles contained in this process were extremely profound and indescribable. Ao Lai and Ao Yin suddenly stood up on their own, feeling as if they were born to stand up instead of kneeling down like before. They couldn't help but be indescribably amazed. However, this amazement only appeared for a moment. After all, to the two of them, Luo Fan was an omnipotent supreme existence. Facing Luo Fan, anything that was inconceivable was a matter of course. Although this situation was inconceivable, if it happened to Luo Fan, it would be incomparably natural. Naturally, there was no need to be overly amazed. As such, the two of them were able to remain calm in the blink of an eye. This divine ability that was inconceivable to the average person was easily dismissed. They said, "If it weren't for you, Master, even though we would have attained immortality, there's no way we could have attained this level of divine ability. Our aptitudes wouldn't have improved to this level either, so how could we not thank you?" Ao Lai and Ao In spoke with great sincerity, and there was an indescribable sense of gratitude in their eyes. When Ao Lai and Ao In had first entered the Sea of Lightning, they were at the peak of the Tribulation Dew realm, still a step away from attaining immortality. The Tao of Golden Wyrm Dragon transformation that they cultivated had also fallen into a bottleneck between magic treasures and magic treasures. As such, they were unable to give birth to true treasure spirits and attain immortality. But now, after being tempered by the Sea of Lightning for trillions of years, they had already attained unimaginable breakthroughs. Not only had they attained immortality, but they had also made several breakthroughs on this foundation. Now, their cultivation realm had already reached the peak of the Golden Immortal realm, which was tens of thousands of times more powerful than when they were at the Tribulation Dew realm. Moreover, this was not all of their gains. The Golden Jiao scissors, which they had transformed into, had been improved beyond imagination over the years. It had broken through several times from the original 81 layers of restrictions. Not only had it become a magic treasure, but it had also broken through the level of the immortal treasure and become a primordial unity treasure. In other words, at this moment, if they combined into one magic treasure, the power of their divine ability would be comparable to that of a primordial unity disbanded immortal. A primordial unity disbanded immortal was the realm of a primordial unity disbanded immortal who cultivated other great ways. The Tao of Fruit of Wei cultivated by Luo Fan was unique in the Untainted Land. It could even be said to be the first complete cultivation method in the Untainted Land that could allow a cultivator to attain immortality and transcend immortality. Naturally, it was more special and mysterious than other great ways. Therefore, the realm of the Tao of Fruit of Wei was greatly different from that of the other great ways. For the Tao of Fruit of Wei, the earthly immortal Tao was divided into three small realms, namely the disbanded immortal realm, the perfected immortal realm, and the golden immortal realm. This was not much different from the other great ways and other cultivation systems. However, when it came to the primordial unity Tao, the Tao of Fruit of Wei was completely different from other great ways and other cultivation systems. After achieving the primordial unity Tao, the Tao of Fruit of Wei was divided into three small realms, namely the primordial unity disbanded number, the primordial unity true number, and the primordial unity golden number. Each of these three realms contained the true meaning of a certain supreme great way. It represented the number of heaven and earth, was recognized by heaven and earth, and could control heaven and earth. However, after achieving the primordial unity Tao, the other great ways did not have this mystery. After achieving the primordial unity Tao, the other great ways only had a great increase in strength, a great improvement in cultivation, and a great understanding of the mystery of primordial unity Tao. It did not contain the true meaning of a supreme great way, nor could it be recognized by heaven and earth, nor could it really control heaven and earth. Therefore, when cultivating the other great ways to this level, this realm could not really be completely distinguished from the three realms of itinerant immortal, perfected immortal, and golden immortal. It could only be called primordial itinerant immortal, primordial unity true immortal, and primordial unity golden immortal. Similarly, after achieving the primordial unity Tao and achieving the zenith heaven Tao, the three small realms were the zenith disbanded Tao, the zenith heaven true Tao, and the zenith heaven golden immortal. This meant that after achieving the zenith heaven Tao, one had already formed a Tao of their own. To a certain extent, one had already broken away from the supreme great way of the primordial world, and had already condensed a kind of great way. For this reason, it was called Tao. As for cultivating the other great ways, other cultivation systems did not have this mystery of the Tao of Fruit of Wei. After achieving the Zenith Heaven Tao, they only comprehended the mystery of the Zenith Heaven Tao. They only possessed the various divine abilities and various powers of the mystery of the Zenith Heaven Tao. Although at this time, the power of their divine abilities would be tens of thousands of times stronger than in the past, In essence, there was still not much difference between them and the Tai disbanded immortal, the Tai genuine immortal, and the Tai golden immortal. They were still living creatures attached to the primordial world, and they still could not be self-sufficient and could not be independent. Therefore, they could only be called the Zenith Heaven Disbanded Immortal, the Zenith Heaven True Immortal, and the Zenith Heaven Golden Immortal. As for the primordial Hun Dao fruit, at this time, Luo Fan could not even touch the edge of it, so he naturally did not know what the difference was. The Disbanded Immortal, the Genuine Immortal, the Golden Immortal, the Tai Disbanded Immortal, the Tai Genuine Immortal, the Tai Golden Immortal, the Zenith Heaven Disbanded Immortal, the Zenith Heaven True Immortal, and the Zenith Heaven Golden Immortal were the 9 realms that ordinary cultivators in the primordial world cultivated. As for the Disbanded Immortal Realm, the Perfected Immortal Realm, the Golden Immortal Realm, the Tai Disbanded Number, the Tai True Number, the Tai Gold Number, the Zenith Heaven Loose Dao, the Zenith Heaven True Dao, and the Zenith Heaven Golden Dao, these 9 great realms were the 9 great realms of cultivating the Dao of Fruit of Wei, including Luo Fan, before achieving the primordial Hun Dao fruit. Although these 2 realms corresponded to each other, the further one went, the greater the difference between the 2 realms. For example, when a cultivator cultivating the Dao of Fruit of Wei was in the 3 small realms of the earthly immortal Dao fruit realm, he might be stronger than the cultivators cultivating other great ways and other cultivation systems, but the degree of strength would not be too much. At most, the difference would be a few times or dozens of times. This kind of difference was still within the scope that celestial tools and magic treasures could make up for. However, when both of them achieved the primordial immortal realm, this kind of difference would increase to hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of times. In other words, a cultivator who achieved the Tai Disbanded Number was at least hundreds of times stronger than a cultivator who achieved the Tai Disbanded Immortal Realm. For someone like Luo Fan, who had an extremely solid foundation and excellent aptitude, this kind of difference could even reach tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of times. Obviously, this kind of difference was far beyond the scope that celestial tools and magic treasures could make up for.